Well, hello and welcome to day 2 of our summer program. This workshop is going to be focused on building up good argumentative skills. So kind of just the basic building blocks for approaching BP debate, and I'll interweave in a considerable amount of strategy as well. But we're going to cover everything from just argumentation all the way through weighing, logical analysis, refutation, and all of that stuff. Okay, let's get some stuff out of the way at the top. This is roughly the argument structure that I use, and I highly recommend doing something that is at least somewhat similar for overarching argument structure, though admittedly the argument structure I'm about to present to you is a bit of a lie because very secretly the comparative portion happens at many points in the argument. So the argument structure that I use starts off with a claim, moves on to logical positioning, then I give reasons for the argument being true, reasons for the argument being important or impacts, and then reasons as to why the impacts are comparative, and finally, weigh the comparative difference in impacts against the comparative difference of impacts from other cases and other arguments made within the debate. Logical positioning, just to be clear, is what it is that the argument is going to achieve with respect to the round. So it's setting up the argument and the things that I'm going to try to do with the argument at the point that the argument is completed. Additionally, I'm planning to throw around a bunch of words throughout this workshop, so let's go over a couple of keywords. First, a mechanism. A mechanism is just an independent logical pathway as to why a certain thing that you're trying to prove is true. So generally these sit below the layer of like a claim or a burden of proof, or even in many instances, impact or refutation. So it is just the independent logical pathway as to why this overarching thing that you're saying is true. Second, analysis. Analysis is anything that sits below the level of a mechanism. So oftentimes you'll give multiple layers of analysis as to why one individual mechanism is true. And again, one mechanism is frequently one of like 3 different mechanisms or something that you're using to prove an overarching claim or burden that you had to prove within the debate. That's what analysis is. It's roughly anything that sits below the level of mechanisms. The next thing that I'll be talking about at many points is weighing. And just to be clear on what weighing is, and whoops, I skipped ahead a slide. Weighing is just doing work to explain why your argument is more important than their arguments. The comparative. The comparative of a debate is the 2 different sides. At many different points in the debate, multiple comparatives will likely be thrown about. So opening government might say, opening opposition's comparative is this, and closing opposition might say, no, actually, opposition's comparative is this. So frequently there will be competing and contested claims as to what the comparative of a debate truly is, but the comparative is just what the 2 worlds of the debate actually look like. Differently, comparativeness is a test of how comparative an argument is. So how much access they have to a specific impact. For example, most impacts in any debate are completely uncomparative. Take, for example, nuclear war. In a motion about social movements, the chances of nuclear war occurring on either side of the house are very uncomparative. And so frequently the goal of a debate is to find which impacts are most clearly the comparative and to impact out that difference in the comparative levels. I'm using the word comparative a lot. The point is, it's the difference of access that you have to an impact or a mechanism than they have. Okay, a couple other words that probably need to be clarified. An actor. An actor is someone whose incentives interact with the effect of emotion. So for example, if emotion is about finance, CEOs are actors in the sense that their motivations are probably changed by the motion, and therefore they act differently and have effects on other people as well. A stakeholder is some entity that is affected by the motion kind of terminally. So children are frequently stakeholders in motions about structuring the education system. Low-income individuals are frequently stakeholders in motions about affordable housing, that sort of thing. Very frequently, entities are both. So, for example, in finance motions, CEOs are probably terminally affected by the motion too. Maybe they lose their jobs, maybe they feel bad about themselves, etc. Mini debates operate around one key stakeholder and measuring the impacts, the different impacts that other debaters will say to them, and many other debates have contests over who are the most important stakeholders in the debate. Some debates have contests over both of these. Third thing to note is just that I've included supplemental material, so please go watch the supplemental material that I've included as in addition to this workshop. It is meant to accompany it and hopefully say certain things way better than I could. I'm going to do three things in this workshop. The first thing I'm going to do is roughly to formulate my theory of debating or how I approach debates. This is something that I hadn't thought about a ton before making this workshop, and so it's very sort of rough sketches, but hopefully it is quite useful for formulating. Well, it's quite useful for me to formulate. Hopefully it's useful for you to see debates through a similar way that I view them. The second thing I'm going to do is just to provide you a large list of things that you need to do to have complete arguments. And I want you to take pretty good notes on these because doing all of these should be your primary focus over the course of this program, with a secondary focus, of course, on learning the content that we're talking about. Both of them are important, but succeeding at the basics well is a prerequisite to any real level of success. Third, I'm going to offer a large number of heuristics. I also want you to take good notes on these and to try to implement them all in drills, see what works for you as inspiration for good content, and then focus on time management with regards to them. It's worth pointing out that all of this will sound like considerably too much at first. That's why you need to target individual skills and work on gaining your footing at those individual skills, and then eventually cut down on them time-wise till you can fit as much of these skills as possible into your speeches. Don't worry about implementing everything in your next debate speech, or even debate speeches that are like a while down the road. This is also part of why good notes are important, because if you don't have good notes, it will be legitimately difficult to do this efficiently. You'll probably have to return to this workshop a number of times. One final note or disclaimer. Remember all the way through this what the point of what you're doing is. I'm including this here because I don't want to have to repeat it at the start of every single skill I cover, but actively think about why you do individual things that we're going to talk about in this workshop. So, for example, the reason that you refute arguments is not because you want to disprove your opponent, it's because you want to beat them in the round, and that has really important implications on what refutation you deliver. Because if the point were purely to disprove them, then you should spend lots and lots and lots of time delivering as much refutation as possible and going down the line by line of their case, one individual detail at a time. But since your goal is to win the debate round, and refutation is one tool at your disposal to win that round, it completely changes how you ideally will do refutation. Rather, it makes sense to deliver refutation that is time efficient, so maybe the strongest things first, and to stop at roughly the point that your material has become, or will become because of your analysis, more compelling than theirs. But even this is somewhat missing the point, because actually there are three different teams that you want to beat, and not one, so you'll probably have to make concessions from even that time efficient point of refutation. And, like, actually, let's reorient ourselves even further. Your primary goal is probably not to beat this one individual team, or even all the teams in this particular round. Definitely not if you're at one of my spars, and probably not even if this round is the bubble of the tournament that you're currently attending. Your primary goal is the long game. Maybe it's to break at Ottawa Worlds. Maybe it's to break at a World 2 to 3 years away. Maybe it's to have a long and successful debate career. Try not to let the urge to win in the moment overpower your actual goals in debate, and practice and attend tournaments with those goals in mind. And this does mean doing things that are inefficient or difficult or scary in round to prioritize making them more efficient and easier and less scary over time. Okay, let's talk about winning debates. EP debate is a format which is characterized by a primary goal and a primary constraint. That is, your primary goal is to be the most persuasive with respect to three other teams in a particular motion, and your primary constraint with regards to that goal is the time that you have within the round and the time that you have to see the motion. To limit the number of variables at play, you know ideally who it is that's judging you ahead of the round. It's the average intelligent voter. They're someone with an eye for logic, but no in-depth knowledge regarding the actual topic of the debate. This gives you roughly four strategies for improving your standing in a debate. Option number one, you could take less time to deliver the same level of persuasion. Option number two, you could make your delivered material more persuasive. Option number three, you can make your opponents take more time to deliver equally persuasive material. And option number four, you can make your opponent's delivered material considerably less persuasive. Let's begin with the first question though. How do you deliver material that is persuasive to begin with? In order for an argument to be persuasive, it needs to satisfy roughly three conditions. First, the argument needs to be sound with respect to the average intelligent voter. This has two components. The first component is that the argument must be factual. So the argument cannot have any premises which contradict ordinarily known facts. So, for example, someone could make a very, very compelling case as to why the sky is green, but judges are allowed to intuition check this and explain that it's simply true. Similarly, but less obviously, someone could make a very compelling case for Bolivia investing really heavily in deep water port infrastructure, but the simple objection that Bolivia has no coastline would completely ruin this argument. The second component is the logical part. That is, the argument cannot have any glaring logical gaps. So take an example. The motion is this house would ban the sale of cigarettes, and you want to make a black market argument. Specifically, that cigarettes are still sold, but now the conditions in which they are sold are less safe. You need to prove a number of things for this claim to be true. The first thing you need to prove is that despite a ban, there will still be demand for cigarettes. Second, that despite a ban, there will still be willing suppliers. Third, that the government will not have the wherewithal to prevent these sales. And fourth, that sales in an unregulated market are less safe than sales in a regulated market. The rough sum of all of these parts, or your burdens of proof, is the argument that you set out to prove. Notice two things about this. First, the argument falls apart if one of these is unproven. So, for example, if you don't prove that there will be willing suppliers, then the opposing side can take out the whole argument by providing simple analysis as to why there won't be suppliers in the market. How do you come up with these burdens? The general rule is just experience is quite useful, but also a very good heuristic is to try to come up with all of the reasonable objections to your argument. Each of these will probably reveal a burden themselves, and without which there would be a logical gap in the argument. If you want a good example of this, please watch International Debating Gym's module on burdens of proof, which is attached as supplemental material. Second, on the internal burdens, for almost every part of this argument, there is at least one who and one why, and the why can generally be broken down into incentive and capacity. Quickly, before getting back into that argument, why is it important to prove both incentive and capacity and not just one? Two examples for this. There are many compelling reasons as to why Russia has a strong incentive to invade Germany. Germany has a very large economy. Russia feels wronged by Germany's participation in funneling aid and weapons to Ukraine. Successfully invading Germany would be an extreme blow to the liberal international order and the United States. So, why does Russia not invade Germany? A plausible reason that you could give for this, for sure, is that there are many competing incentives that Russia has with regards to invading Germany that deter it from doing so. But another reason, maybe, is that Russia literally doesn't have the capacity to launch a full-scale assault on Germany, let alone a successful invasion. And so, Russia, maybe having a very strong incentive to do so, but lacking the capacity for it, decides not to do it, or doesn't do it. Another example to illustrate the incentive necessity. It's probably true that I have the capacity to spend all of the money in my bank account on shares or something, but I lack the incentive to do so, and therefore I don't. These are silly examples, but the point is that without both incentive and capacity, actors generally won't do things, and therefore you need to prove both of them to prove that something happens. Okay, back to the argument. How do we prove this for the argument? The first premise that we had for the argument is that there will still be demand for cigarettes. The actors here are broadly twofold. They are people who are addicted and maybe also people who are particularly curious. On the first category, for people who are addicted, it is quite difficult to get off of cigarettes. Maybe you have more of a personal connection with convenience store clerks who might point you in the direction of where to purchase them after the ban is instated. Notice that we've proven both incentive and capacity in this instance. Second, on the people who are particularly curious, their friends, family, or role models, maybe they smoke. Maybe they just want to try to experiment, as is fairly normal as you're growing up. And it's not that difficult to find a drug dealer in the age of like internet anonymity. It's very easy to just find one on an anonymous site, and therefore you have both the incentive and the capacity in some instances. The second premise is that there will be willing suppliers, and the way that we could go about proving this is to say that either existing drug supply networks or people who want to take advantage of the price premium that's created by banning legal supply while demand stays relatively constant have a very strong incentive to filter into the market. Now, notice what this is doing, because this burden itself is proving the capacity for the previous burden, because we proved that there is an incentive for people to still demand cigarettes. But we didn't prove that they had the capacity to buy them per se, at which point we don't have access to our harms. And so the second thing is kind of proving the capacity for the first. In fact, the third thing is also proving the capacity for the second, because the third burden is that government regulation won't work. And in order for there to be suppliers, they need to be unregulated, or the government cannot be able to just simply crack down on them. So why might government regulation not work? Maybe it requires large sums of personnel, but governmental budgets are frequently thin things. And this sort of regulation frequently competes with more pressing priorities and therefore gets cut. But even if the government had requisite forces to efficiently crack down, detecting this sort of crime is very difficult because transactions are often small scale and dispersed. See how the analysis here is kind of two-tiered to the point that we prove that this could happen, or that it isn't likely for regulation to happen. And then we also prove that even if the government had the existing incentives for regulation to happen, well, they don't have the capacity to enforce that regulation regardless. Okay. The next burden is just that sellers will do things, or sorry, not that sellers will do things, that the product sold in unregulated markets is worse than in markets where it is regulated. So the analysis we might give here is that sellers have a strong incentive to get you hooked on their products, both to keep you returning, but also to compete with other vendors by doing things like lacing cigarettes with stronger drugs or just altering nicotine levels to be considerably above industry standards. On the comparative, industry standards and regular checks exist that prevent corporations from doing this sort of thing. So we're providing comparative analysis as to why the problem is bad on one side and not as bad on the other side. Notice for all of these that you need analysis. You cannot just assert that people act in particular ways. You have to have a reason as to why. And frequently, these reasons at the base level are either contextual, psychological, or economic. How do you come up with this analysis? Generally, just asking yourself why over and over again is a good solution. Why would there still be demand for cigarettes? Well, addicted people will probably still want to get them if possible. Why will they still want them? Because addiction literally hijacks your reward system by creating dopamine associations with certain actions, and so on. If you're a particular flavor of philosophically annoying, you'll have probably noticed a problem at this point. For each claim we are arguing is true, we need to introduce a different claim as a reason that it is true. But don't you now need some reason for the claim that you're saying is true for this overarching claim to be true? And so on ad infinitum. How do we avoid this infinite chain backwards? This genuinely was one of the biggest problems I struggled with during my sophomore year of debate. I felt the need to extend the chain of reasoning down to a complete logical base, and I could never find that. And as a result, I felt as though all of my arguments were highly ungrounded. I've got a few notes here.
The first thing to say is just that this reveals an important role of intuition in making arguments. The bottom layer of your arguments will very frequently be an intuition pump. What is an intuition pump? This is language that is fairly important for a couple of the future workshops that we'll work on, and it's quite useful to know because lots of people will talk about it, and it's just a useful piece of vocabulary to have. An intuition pump is just a thought experiment, an illustration, or an example which makes the judges think that they already believe the thing that you are telling them. So, two examples to illustrate the two primary ways that intuition pumps are used in debate. First, imagine you want to prove the claim, quote, people should not inherit enormous amounts of wealth. You could go about proving this through well-constructed logical reasons, such as the fact that very frequently these people have misaligned incentives, having been born into wealth and not understood the plight of working class citizens, and so are unwilling to do things like, fund charitable ventures, which are more likely in whatever world the comparative is, or something like this. You could also even provide logical reasons as to why it feels unfair. So maybe people feel bad because certain people are granted a chance that they never were, etc. But you could also approach this with an intuition pump. For example, you might say, imagine two people. One spends 30 years working as a surgeon, the other inherits 500 million at birth, yet hasn't worked a day in their life. And yet, despite their clearly uneven contributions to society, the second person has vastly more political influence, social mobility, and economic security. This intuition pump primes the judge to believe in your preceding arguments as to why this is fundamentally unfair, and also provides a good basis as to why this is quite practically bad. This priming is one way that an intuition pump can be used, and it is the way that supercharges logical reasons that follow it. Second example, returning to our example motion, maybe you want to improve the logical basis for, quote, people who are addicted find it difficult to quit nicotine. You might use an intuition pump along the lines of the following. Notice how you are addicted to your phone, how difficult it is to put down Instagram Reels at night, or how frequently you find yourself habitually endlessly scrolling. Nicotine addiction is far, far stronger than that. You literally feel physical discomfort and anxiety if you give it up for extended periods of time. It rewires your brain's reward system to focus on it, especially if you're a hardened addict and you've been doing this for years, and it's one of the few things that brings you some sort of solace in life. Maybe that last bit was a little too extreme. But the point is, this illustration, the first part is honestly somewhat unnecessary and not super, like, you don't need to give the example that is less bad than what you're going to intuition pump about. But it's useful, I guess, for putting judges in the shoes. But the intuition pump makes the judges feel what it is like to be in the shoes of the person you're talking about here, and makes the claim that you're making feel very, very intuitive to them. This is a sort of way that you can use it to undergird logical analysis. So that is, to make it as though logical analysis, which doesn't necessarily reach a base layer of just truth, feels very true to the judges. The primary two ways of doing this are to run the judge through an illustration, so an example, a made-up example hypothetical of the situation, or to say, this is why, for example, and then throw an example in. The second thing that this shows about argumentation, I guess not that it shows about argumentation, but a second note on it, is just that the basis that you need to reach is very, very, very case sensitive. There are probably 4 primary factors that influence this. The first is just your reputation as a debater, whether or not people believe you make good claims that are consistently strong. Your rhetorical capabilities, the topic itself, very frequently topics that are more in the air are going to less low levels of analysis. And fourth, how common the argument that you're running is. Let's focus on this for a second, because I think understanding this is legitimately a bit of an art in itself. I'm going to run you through 2 examples of when I think debaters have been very skimpy on going to deep levels of logical analysis, yet gotten away with it for reasons that are somewhat replicable. It is worth pointing out that both of these debaters have insane reputations, and most people probably could not get away with the exact same thing they're doing, though it illustrates some ways in which you might be able to cut back on the depth of analysis that you have to give in your speeches, as long as you already have a grip on what is sort of intuitive to people.
Why is urban warfare difficult? Because the precision airstrikes that Manuel wants to prop do not work in urban areas. Hint, you know what happens when you try to do precision airstrikes? You get Gaza, mass humanitarian civilian casualties, because you cannot target specific sites. You lack intelligence about where forces are operated, which means civilian casualties get worse on their side of the house, which not only means you don't displace the RSF, you kill civilians in the process.
Okay, let's run through the chain of logic on that first one real quick. The claim is urban warfare is difficult because precision airstrikes don't work. Why don't they work? Well, you cannot target specific sites. You lack intelligence about where forces are operating. Why can't you target specific sites? No reason is given. This is probably intuitive enough that you could fill in the analysis as to how frequently these are constant high-rise buildings, or how there are frequently many important infrastructural buildings around these that suffer collateral or something like that. Maybe, in a different round, it would be efficient as a way of painting out the impacts to go into that depth of analysis, but in this round I think there's probably a lot of time pressure and you really can't go to that level. You kind of have to do a lot more of the strategic meta commentary of the debate, or at least interacting on the level that other debaters are. Also, it's worth pointing out that the round itself, the motion, is zoomed out enough that this is probably a fine level of analysis for receiving credit in most rounds like this. Better question though. Why do you lack intelligence about where forces are operating? Again, no reason is given for this, and personally I don't think that this is intuitive enough to credit by itself, but the rhetorics of the speech make you primed to credit it. The 2 reasons that this is followed up by act as explanations of the commonalities between this situation and Gaza. And you, as a judge, have already been told that this happens. You know about an analogous situation, so you're set up to believe already that it is true even without deeper analysis. Let's play the second example. Real quick, before we get into it, the motion for this debate, as it is relevant here, is as follows. It has an info slide. Human influence refers to the ability of artificial intelligence systems to exert influence over humans by mimicking human features and behavior. Examples of this include strategic human-like bargaining, persuasion, and emotional engagement. The motion is, this House opposes the development of AI systems to optimize for human influence.
Finally, the upsides of AI are just not that big compared to the benefits of the other things we can do. First, because it is good to give humans a place in the economy. It is good that AI has something that humans cannot do, or that humans have something that AI cannot do, rather. Because that is what allows us to differentiate ourselves and our identity from AI. It is what allows us to derive meaning from the fact that this super intelligent being can't be human the way we are. It is what what means that there is still a place in the economy, still a place in the running of systems into the future for people, because AIs can never interface directly with people. They can never be trusted by people. But also, our system is one that is likely to be more effective. It's one that targets the things that humans can't do, like really complex maths, like the folding of proteins. And it is one that is likely regulated better when the AI companies do not have access to tools that in every sense are tools of control, are tools of manipulation, are tools of destruction, are tools of violence, are tools that we just should not allow into our society.
A primary claim is made in this portion of the speech, that is, that there are benefits to not developing this sort of artificial intelligence systems. And there are two reasons that are given to this. Let's interrogate both of them. The first is because it is good to give humans a place in the economy. It is good that humans have something that artificial intelligence cannot do, and then a bunch of impacts of that. The mechanism to reach these impacts is then illustrated at the end of them, that is, that AI can never be trusted by people. And this is the tie to how you gain access to humans having something that artificial intelligence cannot do. I think this is perfectly fine and worked out to a decent enough depth, though maybe somewhat questionable still, but that might just be me being interventionist with regards to AI. The more important piece of this one is just the fact that the mechanism as to how you get to the impacts is actually given at the end of the impacts, and I think that that's an interesting way of structuring your speech and very much something that is legitimate. The second part of this is far more interesting, though. AI systems will be developed to be more effective, to do things like really complex mathematics or protein folding. Why? No reason whatsoever is given. Instead, the mechanism is illustrated by the impacts themselves. If you listen to it, you probably fill in something along the lines of the following. Human influence is extremely profitable, which means investors have a strong incentive to invest in efforts towards those ends if it is on the table, which means crowding out of investment for other more productive purposes that would be more useful to society. All of this is illustrated by the impacts, which have a subtle, clearly less profitable nature to them. There's a real chance that you don't make these intuitive jumps, and there's a good case that against making them for debaters as a judge. But because we're so exposed to ChatGPT and how big of a sensation it is also reasonable to make this sort of leap. This is similar to how common arguments allow people to skip burdens. You might not know what the state power principle is, but any good judge has heard this 3,500 times. And so when I say the words state power principle, people deserve the right to vote, it's the only way we consent to a state which heavily restricts our freedoms, there's a real chance that I get away with making that as a principled argument in a good round. In fact, I have before, with worse analysis. Third thing that this, note on this. I think the correct move is actually to reorient your goal. So instead of trying to find a logical basis, look for a level that will be highly unproductive and difficult for your opponents to challenge. So, for example, with regards to addiction, it will be very difficult for a team to challenge analysis at the layer of, quote, addicted people will still want them. This is just an intuitive truth. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't go below this layer of analysis. It just means that you only should do so if there's like a legitimate point to it. So, for example, maybe here the point is to illustrate how deep of a push addiction is on your psyche, to illustrate the true lack of choice that highly addicted people have and decisions regarding the substance that they're addicted to. But unless you have that explicit point, generally it doesn't make sense to go below the level of intuitive analysis that other teams aren't going to challenge. Quickly, this also has implications on debates with intuitive motions, this also has an implication on debates with intuitive motion to impact chains. So, for example, in a motion about banning contact sports, it is intuitively true that contact sports causes injuries, and you don't need to do all that much analysis to prove that. So, however, teams that stop at the level of intuition will likely struggle with material generation in a round like that. It is quite shallow. Remember that you can and should go past the point of intuition if it has a particular purpose to it. So, for example, we could provide analysis as to how there are strong incentives to do things which are likely to result in injuries. The fact that injuries are so common comes from a difficult to correct institutional failure, and the result is a systematic exploitation of athletes' desire for money and or viewing pleasure. And that's the sort of analysis that, even if it is somewhat like you don't need to go to the level of to prove your argument is true, it's quite impactful if you're able to prove all of those individual parts which undergird to something which is much more intuitive to judges. An alternative, safer stopping point to avoid the infinite regress problem would be to try to give analysis that stops at the level of something that can be construed as an objective fact about the way things are. That is, if you don't believe in your ability to get to something that you think will not be contested in the debate. So, for example, in the motion about banning cigarettes, because addiction literally hijacks your reward system by creating dopamine associations with certain actions, is a statement that is for all debate purposes just a truth about the world. And to be clear, there's a skill in debate that is simply getting away with saying things that are somewhat controversially true about the world as brute facts or about the way we or the world are. I've flipped the slide too early, but it's worth noting that the factual and logical components of truth are fairly obviously justified with respect to the WDC manual, but they're also justifiable with respect to persuasive standpoint. So, one, very obviously, if an argument contradicts a well-known fact about the world, judges will likely internally flag this and write the argument off. But two, these increase your plausibility. If you don't explain that there will be willing suppliers, then you've proven a large portion of the argument, but the judge has to fill in one of the key logical premises, which leaves the actual size of the argument up in the air to judge discretion. And it's much more compelling to actually provide good analysis there. One additional note, causality is probabilistic rather than absolute, and this goes for refutation to causality too. Judges will frequently believe that both could be the case and decide debates by a balance of probability based on what's been analyzed. Your goal with building constructive, truth-based analysis is to convince judges that your argument is likely. Frequently saying things with certainty does help those ends, but do remember that you don't have to prove complete certainty to win any debate. Second condition that an argument needs to satisfy, it has to be important. You can provide lots of compelling analysis as to why a claim is true, but none of that necessarily means that the outcome of that claim is important. So, for example, in the motion, this House opposes the narrative that liberalizing your economy is the best way to achieve rapid economic development, you may have given compelling analysis as to why this narrative leads Western development institutions to condition aid on liberalization because developing countries have a strong incentive to not liberalize any portions of their economies, and the widespreadness of this narrative in Western development institutions leads them to overblame those background conditions and overcorrect against them. This might all be true, but it's not clear why the endpoint of your argument itself is persuasive. You require impacts. Maybe this liberalization requires cutting social spending, which means ordinary people are less able to make ends meet. Maybe your local champions are outcompeted before you can start an innovation flywheel. Maybe trade liberalization means the reduction of tariff revenue, which is likely an important and large portion of the governmental budget, which might mean underfinancing things like infrastructure, education, other generally socially good investments. As an important note, all of these have burdens of their own. Take the third, for example. That is, that maybe trade liberalization means the reduction of tariff revenue, which is an important part and large portion of the government budget, which results in underfinancing socially good investments. This has at least three burdens. First, that loan conditionality requires trade liberalization. Second, that tariff revenue is a considerable portion of government budgets. And third, that spending will be cut from socially good investments. All of these burdens require analysis before they're compelling and actually count as real impacts. As a second important note, many of these have second-order impacts. So these increase the compellingness of your argument, but are not central to having credited arguments. So the time spent on these should be round-by-round decisions. Just to be clear on what I mean, the fact that things like education are underfinanced have very obvious immediate ramifications on people. That is, a lowered ability to get jobs in competitive talent markets abroad, decreased funneling into local expertise, etc. But they also have long-term ramifications. That is, when education is structurally underfunded, harms compound over time, meaning that innovation 100 or so years down the road is magnitudes below where it would be if education received proper funding. Rich places have strong access to private funding, and therefore they grow at significantly faster rates than localities that are reliant on the state, meaning that inequality worsens over time as well. That sort of thing. Those are the sort of things that are second-order impacts. A good impact fills two conditions. First, it is uncontentious or justified. So this basically means either other teams will not contest the impact, take, for example, people's quality of life improving in some way. And by contest, I mean like literally the value of the impact itself. It is quite plausible that teams will say, no, our impact is larger. That's not what I'm talking about here. Additionally, maybe having better access to job security, saving lives, these sorts of things that are just sort of like terminal ends in themselves. The second option is that you've justified why your endpoint is good. There are roughly two ways of doing this. Either you can explain why the specific situation, the thing that is achieved, so for example, maybe if your impact is something like people becoming more distrustful of the government, it isn't clear that this is a good thing by itself, so you want to provide analysis as to why, in this instance, it's an important safeguard against governmental abuse or something. Or you can explain why the impact is principally good. So, for example, maybe a motion impacts out to increase choices, which isn't clearly something that is good by itself, but you can say on principled ground that increased choices is good for like autonomy reasons or whatever. The second thing that a good impact fills is that it should be specific. So, wow, I did these out of order. That's okay. It should answer all of the following questions. First, who's affected? Second, how are they affected? And third, what do they look like on the other side of the debate? The third condition, yeah, there we go. We got to it finally. But back to argumentation. The third condition that an argument needs to satisfy is that it must be comparative or topical. This is the step that should generally be built into the previous two. In fact, it's something we've kind of done already. In impacting, we want to compare the effect of the motion to a world without it, as we do when we say that over generations, innovation is magnitudes below where it would be if education were funded properly. Though, admittedly, this assumes the comparative that education would be funded properly, and very plausibly you can make a counter-argument as to why maybe it won't be. Additionally, in argumentation, we explained not just that unregulated markets were unsafe, but why it was less safe than a regulated market, which does the comparative analysis on our mechanism. The primary reason that I bring this up now is firstly to illustrate that point, because you do need to weave comparativeness into every step of your argumentation. And there's also a very legitimate way of doing this at the end, which is just to say, and on the comparative, their side looks like X. It is slightly less time efficient, and sometimes makes it so it's more difficult to credit your earlier analysis. And I think it is a little more clunky, but I think it is a good way of introducing yourself to doing comparative analysis, which is just to tie it on at the end of everything. The secondary reason that I bring it up right now is just to preview an end for a strategic move that we'll talk about in the future. Let's go a bit further on expanding on the first thing, though. A very common debater trap is just to run the biggest impact that you can. Let's take example motion 1 again. That is, this house would ban cigarettes. Is it relatively feasible to prove that nuclear war happens to follow from this impact? I expect Teddy could construct some sort of causal chain with at least a dozen or more individual links and maybe get there. But this wouldn't be remotely persuasive or time efficient, because now you have probably well over a dozen burdens that you have to provide considerable analysis for, and you'll never get through that in 14 minutes of speaking. Even if you did, most likely, the judges will just write off the argument at hearing the point of the impact. And even if you got past all of that, the argument would likely fall to the very quick piece of rebuttal, while whether or not we ban cigarettes is probably one of a myriad of factors that could potentially result in nuclear war. So the actual difference of this impact is as a result of this debate is minimal at best. In effect, the argument's impact is not a comparative impact. The question to ask yourself is, if this motion played out in the real world, what would the actual impacts of it be? That is generally the point of debate after all. These are effectively just thought experiments that we're running and applying to the real world. Obviously, the flip of this is also true. So if your dad is a smoker and you know for a fact in a way that is very easy to prove that he has a particular moral conscience and that will prevent him from smoking once cigarettes are banned, you could probably make this argument in a way that makes it compellingly unchallengeable. But it probably won't be that compelling to the judges, because even though it is very clearly comparative, it's far too small of an impact to filter into the decision meaningfully. Okay, we set up the baseline for something being persuasive, but remember, you don't win debates by being persuasive in a vacuum. You win the debate by being more persuasive than the 4 other teams in the round. And this is where refutation, weighing, logical positioning, and framing all come into play. First, on logical positioning. So logical positioning is effectively the impact of something that you did on the round itself. So this is the meta-commentary. It looks like saying, if we prove this argument, then opening opposition cannot reach their impact of X, because we've made it logically contingent on our outcome, which they don't have access to. It can also be done in hindsight, that is, after an argument has been delivered as to what it is that the argument achieves. Very frequently, logical positioning requires a before and after sort of analysis. So here's where the debate was before our analysis, here's where it is or is going to be after. In some cases, the before can be left as implicit, such as the example in which I gave a moment ago. It might make it particularly potent to do analysis as to why opening opposition is beating opening government because of the analysis that you're about to defeat. One example of what this looks like successfully, go watch outrounds at good tournaments. Most speakers deliver some amount of logical positioning. Just to be clear, and to set up this for later, in effect, this is delivering your path to victory in the debate, explaining what it is that you plan to do to win the debate or to beat certain teams concisely. Generally, it looks like, but is not limited to, one of the following. First, positioning your material as filling in a key burden that your top half missed, on back half specifically. This can be a logical step, without which their argument doesn't stand by itself. It can be just explaining why their argument matters, which, while your impacting is obviously logically dependent on their argument, renders the importance of their argument dependent on you. It could also be explaining why their argument's impacts are enough for them to beat other teams, which, again, while still dependent on their stuff, renders the comparison with other teams dependent on your analysis. Second, it could look like positioning your material as central to the most important thing in the debate. So on back half, this generally looks like if you're delivering a horizontal extension, you should accompany this by how your top half missed this material, and regardless of what your position is, it should always be accompanied by why this is the most important thing in the debate. So for example, you can maybe say, this debate is about framing. This debate turns on immediacy of impact. This debate hinges on what the comparative looks like for a particular actor. And obviously, that is not enough. You have to explain why those things are the key question of the debate and what they do to the debate as it is played out or as it is likely to play out. And then obviously you also have to deliver how your case answers that question better than other teams. As a more concrete example, if the motion is, this house would ban zoos, and opening government says that animals suffer in captivity, and opening opposition responds with mitigation, a plausible but not highly certain flip as to how maybe they suffer more outside of captivity, and that zoos are educational and enjoyable for humans, if you are closing opposition, you could explain that the government side's best case hinges on the question of whether or not animals have moral claims that are strong enough to override human benefits, and that if that answer is no, then government's claims, even if they could plausibly be more severe, are morally secondary to the minor benefits that we as humans derive. All of this would be in setup for a case which argues, of course, that animals don't have moral claims, which is, you can run that if you want to. But that would be a more concrete example of what this would look like. The third thing that this can look like is just positioning your material as responsive to the most persuasive things forwarded by the opposition side. I think the last example was a bit of an example of that. Obviously these are loose lines that are not highly definitional per se, or have concrete boxes around them. The fourth thing this can look like is just positioning other material as logically dependent on yours. And very obviously you can do this to top half, as I talked about with back half positioning, but you can also do this to other material within the debate. So one very obvious example of this is preservation of life versus quality of life debates. Very obviously, any positive impact is contingent on people being alive in the first place. Less obviously, you can actually flip the dependency, and we'll talk about that later on when we're talking about principles. The point is that you can render the other side somewhat logically contingent on your, advantage, and explain that interaction within the debate. There are many other ways that you can do this. One final one that I will talk about here is just positioning other material as logically insufficient to win the debate. So explaining that this material, maybe it was good, but it isn't enough for them to actually win the debate in some way or another. Or it isn't enough to do the interactions that they say it does with the debate, that sort of thing. There are many, many different ways to logically position. Go watch high-level rounds and pick up a repertoire of these. A repertoire? I don't know. And, the things that you can use in a round. Okay, it turns out Celsius is not very hydrating. What are some good heuristics for coming up with logical positioning? 1. What does a judge need to believe before they believe any team in the round? Why do they need to believe this, and how do you address it? Common examples of this include that autonomy is more important than utilitarian returns in debates which could plausibly lead people to make bad choices by removing restrictions on their options, that democracy is valuable regardless of its instrumental outcomes in debates about technocracy, that we have a particular moral duty to a certain stakeholder in any debate where different stakeholders could be prioritized, etc. Second, keep an eye for missed burdens in arguments. even if they go unchallenged. Always keep in mind, though, if you're doing this, why the burden was particularly important for the argument in the first place. Third, what assumption is everyone else making but not proving? How do you address that assumption? What does it do to the other material in the round? And how does that advantage your side? Common examples of this include actors will respond to things rationally. Social narratives will actually be internalized in the first place. People will trust a particular policy. All of these things are frequent assumptions that people make that affect the way the debate plays out that you can quite often challenge. Fourth, and similar to the first, what is the highest level of clash that the debate will collapse into? So, security versus liberty, growth versus risk, distribution versus efficiency, and why do you answer that clash best? To be clear, you can provide logical positioning for analysis regardless of whether or not it achieves one of these big things, but just keep in mind what it is that your analysis is doing to the debate and why what it does is productive for you winning. It is generally worth keeping this in mind anyway. Frequently, you provide analysis that has a purpose in debate. This is just the process of making that explicit and told to the judges. If you're running something, you probably implicitly understand the answer to both of those questions already. Okay, there's not a very clear distinction between this and weighing when this is done after the case has been delivered, and framing when it's done before the case is delivered. Framing and weighing, in fact, are both distinct forms of logical positioning, though I think their connotations are somewhat separate in the fact that they are less associated with doing meta-arguments about the debate, and instead with harnessing facts about the real world or persuasive statements to shift the way the debate is viewed. Before moving on, one concrete example of what this looks like.
Problem with anger is that in your anger, you burn down your friends, you burn down your enemies, and you end up burning yourself. I think opening government proves really well why there is likely to be anger. I think in that they are correct. I think they do not prove, firstly, why anger results in democracy, and that why the protest transitions to democratic leadership. Because if you listen to the conditions for democracy in PM, these are things like democratic institutions, things like elections, things like the ability of people to go to schools, to be educated and participate in democratic society. You don't do this when you're protesting. So the end goal of opening government is the case doesn't exist, because even if they prove the protests start, there is no analysis to explain why they end within the 10 years and transition to democratic institutions. But I'm going to move more than that. I'm going to prove to you that they're going to transition into non-democratic institutions, where it's going to be worse than it is in the status quo.
I think this is a particularly potent example because of how well it pairs a very rhetorically strong introduction with a great explanation of why their case, if proven, just completely beats opening government. I think, and to be clear, this is not to say that you shouldn't do logical positioning in other positions, that there are 4 positions in the debate where this is particularly potent when done well. The first is as the deputy leader of opposition, as in the example. You get the last word against opening government. You don't even have to take a POI from them. So if you set up their case as below yours, it is very, very difficult for them to beat you in the round. Second, as a member of government, you've seen the whole top half debate play out. You can quickly win the debate over them by logically positioning your case or a contribution as effectively prior to or far more important than the top half primary clash. Third is the opposition whip. Simply because you have the last word, you get to decide how the logical positioning plays out in the end. And fourth, as a prime minister, because you chose the most important arguments for a reason, you should communicate that reason compellingly to the judges, do a good job of running those arguments, and you will have a hard time losing the debate at the point that you've explained why it is that they are likely to win. Why is this so strong? First, similar to framing, and we'll talk about this in a second, this looks somewhat impartial. It looks like taking facts about the debate, making it clear and followable, and then explaining why these facts happen to line up in your favor. Second, it generally involves crediting what other teams have done very well, engaging with their best case, and explaining how you still win out against them. Third, it can sidestep very difficult to win questions. So, for example, if the top half has an intense debate on whether a policy's impacts are good and bad, you can do logical positioning to say, well, the thing that this debate turns on is how this policy affects a particular group of stakeholders, then explain why. There are lots of reasons for this, we'll get into them with weighing, and then give compelling analysis focused solely there. And if done right, you don't have to worry at all about the massive top half clash that gave compelling reasons for other groups, and this will beat the entirety of that complicated clash. I will add one final note before moving on here. Sorry, this section is probably somewhat weak and not systematic. This is one of the things that I have a central goal to work on right now, and so I don't have perfect heuristics for it, nor do I have fully formulated thoughts around it. Okay, let's talk about framing. Framing is analysis which shifts the focal point of the debate with regards to the real-world version of the debate, not the material inside the debate. Try to think of the end of the debate as a picture of the real world, which has been illustrated to various degrees by all the material the different teams have argued. Framing acts as deciding which portions of that picture are in focus to judges. Something you'll notice, or at least that I noticed, when judging really good rounds, when watching really good rounds like the HWS round robins or world finals, is that at the end of every single speaker's speech, you feel as though you've come around to and to see how their worldview of the debate works. While having logical rigor is useful to those ends, framing is probably the primary skill which allows for that, for you to feel compelled by each individual world that is forwarded of the debate. Importantly, framing cannot be assertive. Do not just say, the debate only happens in highly functional democracies, or even, the debate has the most impact in highly functional democracies by itself. Explain why. Maybe it's because the debate is about selling your vote, and in democracies with minimal checks on power and corruption, things to that effect already somewhat happen, and so the debate is less comparative than it is in democracies which explicitly outlaw and enforce the ban of that behavior. The general way to do this is to introduce some characterization or characterizations which shift the importance of particular contexts, actors, or stakeholders. We'll return to characterizations later, but framing should be accompanied by logical positioning as well. Where was the debate prior? Where is it after? Why is your material advantageous in the after phase? Framing is also useful for time efficiency in another way that we'll come back to later on as well, but internally it reduces the load on you for weighing later down the line in your speech as it sets out at the top which impacts matter the most and gives the fundamentals as to why those impacts matter the most. Okay, we'll talk about weighing then. Arguments win against other arguments by having more important impacts than them, but what about two arguments that are roughly equal to each other in weight? Judges still need, at the end of the debate, to come to a decision between these two arguments. This is where weighing comes into play. The importance of an argument is roughly a factor of 4 different things, and weighing is explaining which of those things the judges should decide the debate through. I said 4. I think it's 3. Those 3 things are the scale of the impact, the likelihood of the effect, and how much we should care about the people who are affected. Each of these has further ways that it can be broken down. So first, on scale of the impact. Before getting into the minutiae, one very common weighing debate is between a high-scale, low-probability impact and a low-scale, high-probability impact. This is the only time that I'm going to give you an illustration pump, but I'm going to use this to illustrate the sort of intuition pump, to illustrate the sort of intuition pump that you might use to win the weighing debate. And we'll talk about this again later, but very frequently you have to win a debate between 2 different ways of weighing the round. Here's the intuition pump. Suppose that you have the option to implement a policy that will make millions of people living in your city's lives considerably better with a very high degree of certainty. Yet, there's a small chance that doing so causes a massive dam by the city to break, flooding the city and killing everyone. Most people would not opt to pass this policy, even if they knew that the probabilistic expected value of it was positive, say, in economic terms. This is because we know that there are certain risks that are so severe that we ought to do everything in our power to prevent their occurrence. Here's an obvious relevant application of this weighing. The creation of artificial superintelligence, for example, would be a debate where this is sort of highly efficacious. Anyway, the point is, this is a sort of intuition pump you could use to explain why you should care more about the metric that you're using than the metric that they're using. And one important note about weighing is that while I'm about to give you a bunch of metrics that are all hopefully somewhat useful, and I'll give you some ways of weighing between them as well, but you should always, in any debate, and the reason I'm not doing this systematically is just because there are so many different metrics and it is very difficult to explain how each one beats each other one, but you should in every single debate justify why your metric is plausibly the most important in comparison to the other metrics that teams might be winning on. Okay, The first subsection of scale is just how many people are affected. There are roughly 3 common weighing clashes with numeric weighing. The first is, why does the number of people matter more than the severity of impact? And one way that you can go about winning this is to point out that large in scope, that is, large number of people affected impacts, frequently create systemic effects. So, for example, if 10 million people become unemployed on our side, even if 100 people die on theirs, on our side the changes legitimately frequently in state trust, crime levels, family stability, etc., which in effect co-opts their metric via second-order impacts. Second, why does the number of people matter more than the likelihood of the impact? And this can use similar weighing as mentioned at the top of this category. You can also point out that if the debate is between a high likelihood impact and a low likelihood individually impactful thing with large enough numbers involved, potentially yours is just more likely on aggregate to take effect. So maybe it has a low chance of happening to each individual within society, but given that it is something that affects so many, that could plausibly affect so many people, that means that maybe yours is winning on certainty because you know it will affect a number of people, or something like this. The third is just, why does the number of people matter more than the vulnerability of people impacted? There are probably at least 2 compelling ways to weigh here. The first is that we have no obligation to help the most vulnerable. Just as people didn't choose to be born into their shoes, they also didn't choose to be born into middle-class shoes. And to show a preference towards one would be, in effect, discriminating arbitrarily towards an even larger group of individuals. I bet you feel very moral after that line of analysis. The second is to co-opt their criterion. So quite plausibly, given that your group is particularly large, there are vulnerable populations inside of it. Find them. Illustrate what this impact looks like for them. If you can explain why they are more vulnerable than the group the other side has access to, try and do that. Second, under scope, or whatever I said the overarching category here is I think, scale. How severely are the individuals affected? So there are a couple of subsections under this too. One of them is just how unique is the effect. So, for example, plausibly, impacts to athletes and sports motions are far more compelling when compared to impacts on fans, because fans can find all the benefits that they get from sports, for example, a sense of community, friends to get drunk, loud, and annoying at bars with, etc., from different things, whereas athletes cannot get the same competitive enjoyment out of a different thing because the top football athlete is a mid-tier at best boxer, or because they've developed particular emotional attachments to the sport, or something like this based on the impact that you're doing. Second subsection here, how reversible is the impact? So, for example, one reason to prioritize preventing climate change harms over things like financial stability is because we cannot reverse damages to the environment, but we do have tools to reverse equally damaging fiscal crises or financial crises. Third, how adaptable are they to the effect? If we know that one person has to be fired and we're deciding between someone who has a good job prospect in the immediate future and someone who likely won't be able to pick up another job for some time, let's say both are fairly low income, we would probably think it is more moral to fire the first individual because they will adapt better to the harms associated with being fired. The third subsection under scale is just how long-lasting is the impact. Very simple reasoning as to why this is important. Far more people will exist in the future than exist right now. Their preferences are legitimate preferences because it is pure happenstance that you happen to be alive right now, and we should, not discriminate against people based on happenstance and factors outside of their control that are arbitrary. Therefore, you should prefer long-lasting benefits and avoid long-lasting harms, even if the immediate-term impact is considerably more acute. The fourth under scale, is just how frequently does the effect happen. So to weigh this one, you roughly need to turn it into severity or to turn it into a scope, I guess. That is, why does the fact that this happens over and over to accumulate over time, such that in the long run, this is a very intense impact. Second box of weighing metrics is likelihood, as I talked about at the start here. So the first thing is just how likely is the impact to occur. A very fun piece of weighing to be really good teams is non-contingency or clarity. So maybe there was a really good debate in the top half on one particular clash, but at the end of the debate, despite both sides being compelling, it's not clear that the team which won the clash won it by all that much at all. So maybe as a result, an off-clash argument that you introduce can win the debate over them. This is also a really good strategy for deputies and prime ministers if you're able to predict this. So a good example of this debate, or of this as a weighing metric that can be used, is basically any debate about which market you appeal to as a small business, media outlet, or even an up-and-coming gay mangaka. most likely the profitability clash will be so saturated by the end of the debate that having a clear independent impact that isn't contingent on profitability just wins by itself quite easily. The second, under likelihood, I know we're like 3 deep on likelihood right now, is the likelihood of it occurring. This is like pretty self-explanatory, and we already went into the likelihood versus scale debate. Turns out that the likelihood versus obligation debate is very similar to that, so I'm not going to get into those right now. Second sub-likelihood category is how uncontentious is the impact. So how likely is it that the impact is good versus bad, or vice versa? If there's a doubt as to its value, then you can win with a less contentious, though arguably less important impact. Okay, I'm realizing I'm far behind on the slides, and these should actually be quite helpful for you understanding where I am at every point, so let's get caught up. Okay, moving on then. The final bucket is care. So there are a number of ways, or I think actually 2 primary ways that you can go about proving you are winning on care. The first is vulnerability. And part of vulnerability is just weighing on severity. That is, the most vulnerable or the most impacted by emotion for similar reasons to the economic law of diminishing marginal returns. That is, your first $10,000 is worth way more to you than your second $10,000. The second way that you can weigh on care is to do with responsibility, and this can be weaponized in 2 ways. First, maybe the end outcome is good, but it's not clear that the people who are forced to be responsible for it should. So, for example, maybe the motion is, this house would require teachers to identify and report early signs of radicalization. One way to weigh against all of the consequentialist clash is just to say, irrespective of the outcome of this debate, whether or not it is good or bad, or results in good or bad positive, utilitarian things, teachers should not be morally responsible or should not be made responsible for producing this outcome. I think it is bad to make them do that for whatever reasons you want to give. Maybe they're moral, maybe they are practical to do with rule utilitarianism, whatever. The point is, you can say the actor who's forced to do this should not have to be responsible for doing this. The second thing is just that you can point out that maybe we have a particular responsibility to prioritize certain stakeholders. So, for example, it is a plausible argument that a state has its first duties towards its citizens because these are the people who it unconsensually restricts the freedoms of on the promise it will prioritize their aggregate interests. Additionally, this is a way to weigh on vulnerability because frequently we can say that the actor in the motion has a particular obligation to the most vulnerable. Maybe it's because the actor had a part in setting up the conditions under which this stakeholder now exists. Maybe it's just because you ought prioritize those who no one else has the means, I guess, or no one else is prioritizing, or whatever else you want to run. You can always say that you don't have the ability to choose what shoes you were born into, and we agree that it is unjust to discriminate based on factors outside of people's control, and therefore, regardless of who's involved in the motion, they ought prioritize the least well-off in society. Logical positioning is frequently considered weighing. So, for example, one weighing metric, which I've not included here, is logical priority, because I've already gone over it, but judges frequently consider it a weighing metric. You can also internally weigh arguments. So there are 2 primary ways of doing this that I've seen. There may well be more. What do I mean by internal weighing? Because it's probably not super self-explanatory. Internal weighing is just saying that your case is the most important because of internal, that is, mechanism-based reasoning, rather than external, that is, impact-based reasoning. Internal weighing is primarily a tool used to win disagreements regarding the interpretation of the motion itself. So, for example, if the debaters say that the motion results in 2 mutually exclusive paths, then you can do internal weighing to explain why your path is more likely more important than theirs. Okay. So there are 2 ways, as I mentioned, to do this. The first is just to say that our version of events is a more likely version. This doesn't really need an intuition pump to prove the importance of whether or not being likely internal to an argument is important. So here are some heuristics for coming up with internal likelihood weighing. 1, you could compare the compellingness of reasons given for each mechanism. Do yours have more analytical depth? Are yours rooted in more realistic characterizations of the world? The second heuristic is to compare logical steps from the motion. So how far out is their impact from the motion versus yours? The third is to compare noise and mechanisms. So how many different unaffected factors, by that I mean things that are not affected by the motion, are involved between mechanisms that they're running, and why does yours have less of that noise per se. The fourth is that maybe we know that things have played out the way that you say they have, but their side is purely speculative. I think this is a scammy way to go about this form of weighing, but sometimes it legitimately does work to make judges feel like your mechanism is more grounded in the real world, or your interpretation of the motion is more grounded in the real world. The second thing that you can do for internal weighing is to explain that the actors affected on your side hold more power to affect others. So, for example, frequently you can use this to explain why impacts to men, say, in feminism rounds, are the most important, because they are structurally advantaged by systems ripe with patriarchal coercion and frequently sit in positions where they can enforce those norms or do away with them. Think the disproportionate number of male CEOs, for example. And as a result, convincing men is frequently a very important thing. You can also just say, well, frequently men are just less convinced of the goals of feminism than women are, for fairly obvious reasons. And as a result, maybe this is more of a comparative change if the narrative that you're pushing as a feminist movement now appeals more to men to get them involved in the first place, or whatever the debate is about. That's everything on internal weighing and weighing. How do you weigh? The first thing you do is to explain the metric that you're winning on the most, or the most advantageously. Second, you should explain why it is that you're winning on it. This has burdens of its own. Take the example, this house supports green central banking. You want to, and in this example, let's say you want to weigh against opposition on reversibility, claiming that environmental harms are less reversible. There are a couple of burdens here. First, there are ways to recuperate from financial harms. Second, that the ways of recuperating from financial harms will actually be used if those financial harms manifest. Third, that mechanisms like that don't exist for recuperating from climate change. The third thing that you have to do for weighing is to explain why winning on that fact is the thing that the debate should hinge on. These are what the intuition pumps that I gave you at the top are for. Therefore, explaining why it is that the judges think that this is the most important question within the debate. You can do this through logic, you can do this through intuition pump, but you need to explain why it is that your metric is the thing the debate should turn on, and you also frequently need to give analysis as to why it is more important than other implicit or explicit metrics that other teams have given. Sorry, I skipped ahead again, but additionally there are 3 ways in which you can weigh your own material, though things generally fit onto a sliding scale here rather than falling at one distinct point or another. The first is that you can weigh your case against their diminished case. So this is after you've given mitigatory rebuttal, you've done damage to their case, and you're weighing why your case, undamaged, is better than their case. The second is that you can weigh your case against their best case. So you can say, and even if you don't believe any of our refutation, here's why we're still going to win over them. And the third is that you can weigh your worst case against their best case. So this is, and even if you don't believe that, even if all of their refutation is correct, or their case is the only one that exists per se. This is difficult to actually visualize, but this comes up in a number of debates, and you can watch rounds to get examples of this. We're still going to win over them, despite our case being much, much diminished at this point in comparison to theirs. And obviously, each of these is more compelling than the last one if it is legitimately done. Okay. Why are these harms irreversible? Because it sends them into a ruinous spiral, because the next paycheck is the thing that's keeping them housed, because they start to feel intense mental pressure as their life threatens to crumble around them, which irreversibly harms their relationships and psyche, that sort of thing. Frequently, if you can cast doubt on their weighing metric to the fact that they're winning it in the debate, then you can follow that up by explaining weighing metrics to say that your metric is more clearly a win than theirs, and therefore, even if both metrics are equally important in the debate, or even if theirs is more important, you should still win the debate for the same non-contingency stuff I talked about with logical positioning. One tool that you can use to help you win the debate is to make your opponent's arguments seem less important than your own. This is what refutation is. Refutation can be leveled at every portion of the argument. That is, you can deliver a refutation that explains that your opponent's arguments were less true than they say they were. You can deliver a refutation that says that they were less important than they say they were. And you can deliver a refutation which says that they were less comparative than they say they were. This gives us a pretty clean delineation of the sorts of rebuttal that you can offer in debates. So the first form of rebuttal or refutation that you can deliver is truth-based rebuttal. So that is, the argument isn't true, therefore you don't get to the impacts in the first place, or it is less true. Second, impact-based rebuttal. So even if you get to your impacts are not as important or not important at all. And third is comparative-based rebuttal. That is, even if your impacts are important, they're not actually comparative and they're achieved on our side too. Notice the way that these can be layered, because it is genuinely quite good to layer your refutation within debates. It makes it more redundant. We'll talk about some other reasons it's important later. But for now, note that generally speaking, the way that you want to layer your refutation is to go, here is why your arguments are not true or less true. Even if they were true, here's why they are not important or less important. And even if they were important, here's why you don't have access to them. And then add on to all of that, and even if you did have full and total comparative access to all of these, here's why our case is still more important than yours, and do the weighing stuff we talked about a moment ago. Truth-based rebuttal can be further divided into the following: truth-based mitigatory refutation and truth-based negation. So truth-based mitigatory refutation is rebuttal that says, well, no, your argument is less true than you say it is. There are a couple of ways you could go about doing this. One of them is just to say that their contextual characterizations are not true in every instance. So, for example, maybe some worker-owned platforms let gig workers govern themselves democratically, but in many instances, this isn't actualized because many workers lack platform engineering capacity or the time to meaningfully participate in collective decision-making. And so, if a team predicated their claims on that specific characterization, you could point out that in not all instances is it true. The second way you can go about this is to say that the mechanism, if the mechanism is dependent on a large quantity of actors behaving in a particular way, why might the actors not behave in that particular way? So, for example, maybe climate change shaming will cause some elites to stop their luxury emissions, but many will likely continue to do so because of whatever competing incentives you want to point out exist. The third way to go about this is if the mechanism is dependent on a singular principal actor, and by principal actor I mean a decision maker, the one who makes decisions. This is not super important debate terminology, but something that probably will come up in this program multiple times. You can ask what things stand in the way of the principal actor doing something even if they have the theoretical capacity and incentive to do so. So, for example, states can regulate banks, and they probably have a pretty strong incentive to because they want to avoid things like financial crises. But frequently, they don't decide to do so as a result of state capture and inefficiencies. Another example, many militaries could win wars, and very obviously they have the incentive to do so because you're a military. But frequently they fail due to poor communication of information and poor coordination. Many companies could raise wages for low-wage workers when faced with public backlash, and maybe they have an incentive too because it's how they could quell backlash, but they'll probably only do so if the alternative competes with their profitability. In effect, they have a stronger countervailing incentive. So just these are all ways that you can diminish the likelihood of the argument being true in the first place. Sometimes you can just completely get rid of it by pointing out that the context in which you're debating about is one in which these characterizations actually happen to fall on your side than the ones in which they fall on the other side. You might notice that all of these are effectively dragging realism into what the opponent said. Debate is very frequently a race to be the most realistic, And this should be a guiding principle for most of your refutation, especially mitigatory refutation. Second option, you can do truth-based refutation. So this is rebuttals that says the argument is just not true. There are a couple of important notes here, because you can do this in a parallel fashion and in a non-parallel fashion. And okay, that I just realized, that is so debate jargony. Parallel fashion or parallel refutation means you're saying that something else is true instead, and not directly saying that the reasoning you use to get to your point is untrue. Non-parallel refutation is engaging directly in what they said and saying this is just not true, not factual, not logical, that sort of thing. So if you're doing this in a parallel fashion, you also need accompanying analysis as to why your claim, as to what is the case, which is somewhat contradictory to their claim, in the sense that both of them cannot be true at the same time, or they can't reach their outcome if your claim is true. You need accompanying analysis as to why your claim is more likely than theirs. Okay, there are a couple of ways of doing parallel analysis. So one of the ways is kind of what we were pointing out a moment ago. Why do the involved actors actually have the incentive to not do what is necessary for the argument to be true? In many instances, you can take out an argument's entire truth value by just pointing that the actors that are required for it literally don't have the incentive or have incentives to not do the thing that is being required of them. A second way you could do this is just, well, do the involved actors have stronger incentives to do other things which directly trade off with the thing that they would be required to do via the argument that was made by the other side? Why might the actors involved not have the capacity to do the thing that is necessary? And fourthly, why might the actors involved not act in their best interest? We're going to return to all of this later, so don't worry too much about not having concrete examples of what this looks like right now. Tomorrow we will return to this, I believe. The non-parallel way of refuting a claim's truth and saying that it is just not true is roughly you have two paths. The first is to reject the context of the argument. So things are not how the opponents say they are a different way instead, and therefore their argument is wrong. The central question here is what picture of the world must be true for their argument to work. If you can concretely disprove that picture of the world, then you can prove their argument is completely false. For example, if a team says that expecting public criticism makes companies self-regulate, this is three assumptions. Also, look, these are burdens for an argument that you would want to run if you were trying to make the claim that your opponents are hypothetically doing here. The first is just that companies are reputation sensitive, that is, they care about their reputation whatsoever, they are affected by it, that sort of thing. Second is that consumers notice criticism in the first place. And third is that reputational damage affects a company's profits, although first and third are a little bit fuzzy. You could reject any of these and take down the argument in its entirety by just pointing out that a burden that is required for the argument is completely untrue, and therefore the argument itself is false. A good example of this is that companies that have a monopoly on a bunch of buyers don't really care about their reputation because they know that people will buy from them anyway. Another good example of this is that many companies primarily sell to other corporations. They're like midpoints in a supply chain, and so they are not at all reputation sensitive because their profit margins aren't being affected if the consumers of the world all of a sudden dislike them because other companies will probably buy them, unless the consumers get upset at other companies for buying them, etc., etc. You get the point. Okay, the second way that you can go about this, that is full truth-based negation, is to say that the logic of the argument does not logically follow itself. That is, the cause does not lead to the effect that they say it does. By the way, as a back half team, this is the literal only form of rebuttal that is disallowed against your top half. Everything else is perfectly fair game, because everything else in this debate, everything else in this section on refutation is stuff that is either contesting the importance of the stuff that your top half said, or introducing new analysis that doesn't directly contradict a claim they said, but maybe has implications on the debate that end up being ruinous for your top half. There are two ways of going about this. One of them is that their argument contradicts known reality. If so, how so? And why should the judge know this? / if it isn't average intelligent voter knowledge, why is it structurally true of the world? Also, this doesn't actually knife them because you're allowed to introduce things, well, the structural trueness those would be a knife. But in instances where it is average intelligent voter logic, ordinary intelligent voter information, it's still not a knife of your top half. The second way to go about this is just, does their argument result in a logical contradiction or absurdity? If it does, then obviously it isn't true by logical reasoning. Those are very rare. I don't think those come up all that frequently within debate. The third way in which you can do truth-based negation is just to say maybe they missed an important logical premise. If so, point this out and then provide analysis as to why the opposite is true or possible. Or maybe just weigh on completeness of argumentation, saying, look, we're better than them because our argument is more complete or whatever. A quick example of this, sorry for the repetition, for folks who have seen my refutation workshop in the past. The motion is, and some of you have debated this, I've judged maybe some of you for this motion, this House supports the narrative that democracy is necessary for the US to function. Opening government says, well, democracy is good, so this motion is good. As opening opposition, you can point out that it's not clear that the narrative that democracy is necessary for the United States to function actually leads to meaningfully more democracy. In fact, the opposite is maybe true. People have a naive understanding of what democracy means. They think it means self-representation and that it should function fluidly and without bureaucracy. This narrative, frequently then, can be weaponized to do anti-democratic things, like, say, storming the Capitol or taking a chainsaw to bureaucratic departments that are obviously non-democratic, but look democratic to individuals who are involved in the actions because they see it as better representation of themselves. Okay, moving on. You can also do impact-based rebuttal. So impact-based rebuttal can be divided into mitigatory rebuttal and negation-based impact rebuttal. So impact negation, similarly to the previous ones, impact negation is effectively you deny that even though the argument is true, the impact actually happens. So there are a number of ways that you could do this. One of them is to introduce a tipping point into the debate. So that is to say the argument doesn't reach a threshold that is required for it to actually have an impact. So one way of coming up with tipping point analysis or introducing a tipping point to their side of the debate is to try and think of what external barriers need to be overcome. So, for example, in any argument about social movements making change through democratic avenues, this argument always requires that social movements get support from the majority of the population. Any poorly done argument on the effects of climate change requires that we reach a tipping point where we stop the impacts of climate change. I say poorly done here because there are actually two ways to turn tipping point arguments into non-tipping point arguments. The first is just to do, as we talked about earlier, scale your impacts. So don't say we fix climate change, say we marginally increase the chance that we can prevent climate change's worst impacts. Second, you can point out that short of a tipping point, there's still a very real and legitimate impact. In this instance, it looks like some number of people having slightly less miserable, slightly longer lives because the spiral of climate change is slightly pushed back, or it's not as severe in the immediate term, or maybe we have a slightly increased time period to technologically and economically and geographically adapt to climate change. Those sorts of things are very real in the moment impacts that don't require you to prove the reach a tipping point at which climate change has stopped. You can do this with most arguments, by the way. Just try and think about ways in which it doesn't require a specific tipping point to reach real impacts for real people. The second thing is mitigatory analysis or refutation on impacts. So you can explain that the impact is less bad or good than they say it is. So one way of doing this is saying, well, the impact is trivial. For example, frequently an effective way of rebutting any argument made from the fear of missing out, for example, that poor people feel bad because they can't take the time off from work to go to the wilderness spaces while rich people get to do so, is just to point out that it is very, very rare that this sort of consideration actually weighs on you legitimately. It's just not something you really think about in the majority of instances. A second way of going about doing mitigatory analysis is to say that people adapt over time. So are there natural ways that society will respond which mitigate this impact? For example, this House regrets the Industrial Revolution motion. A plausible argument from opposition side is, well, now we have all these fancy trinkets which make me happy, like my phone, for example, toilets that spray water at you, that sort of thing. A very good response to this is to say, well, it turns out humans have a sort of baseline level of happiness that isn't heavily affected by the level of technological developments around them. Many people were much happier to live their farm jobs prior to the Industrial Revolution than they are afterwards. In fact, I think you can kind of add a flip here, because arguably a similar number of people still live fairly agrarian subsistence lives, but on the comparative, they wouldn't know that there were people out there living wealthily, throwing away money left and right and exploiting their work. Another thing that you can do on impact-based rebuttal is to do an impact value flip. So this is, you can explain what the value of the impact is and why it is actually the opposite of what they say it is. So, for example, refer back to the last thing here. That would be a flip of technological innovation is good. How do you do this? A few ways. One, you can provide additional characterizing analysis, which explains the context that the thing supposed to be good exists in, makes it actually a bad thing. Again, previous example. Second, you can provide analysis as to how, while the thing is maybe good in the short term, it is particularly bad in the long term, and then weigh the impacts. And third, you can also flip mechanisms. So you can explain how, given a comparative mechanism that they have access to on their side, the result of that mechanism is actually something that is quite bad, and then weigh that against their impact, which maybe is still somewhat standing. Okay, the final form of refutation we'll talk about is comparative-based rebuttal. Unsurprisingly, this can also be divided. There are roughly 3 divisions here. The first is washing clashes, the second is minimal contributions, and the third is a impact side flip. So yeah, I know 2 flips, we'll get there eventually. On washing clashes is genuinely quite a powerful technique. The way that you go about it is by explaining that their argument happens on either side because of factors that are outside of the motion, or alternatively, that it is uncertain to happen on either side because of factors outside of the motion. Importantly, you need to follow it up with a direct comparison to what you focus on and why that analysis that you gave is not true of your own arguments. First example, say we have a narrative that glorifies workaholism, or the motion is this house supports the narrative that glorifies workaholism or whatever. You can claim that people are probably likely to be overworked regardless of this motion. So capitalist pressures exist. You want pay. So even internally, there are frequently incentives regardless of whether or not you glorify the actual act of overworking. So the question then becomes whether or not we want people to feel good about it in the instances where they do overwork themselves. Second example, any motion about economic development has so many things that influence the rate at which a particular country develops. So, for example, the financial situations of globally important countries, natural disasters, voting decisions, etc. It is horribly unlikely that a specific motion is going to have a meaningful effect one way or another. Therefore, maybe some off-clash impact, or maybe the immediate effect on people's livelihoods, is a far more important impact in those debates. That said, I think that one's a little dangerous because I think judges are not super inclined to credit that because they think the debate is about economic development, and quite often that's reasonable. The second thing you can do is to say the contribution is not very much whatsoever. So maybe their problem or benefit exists already, and it's not clear what the marginal difference does. So for example, artificial intelligence increasing the spread of misinformation might be something that is just a true fact. Like this is something that is going to happen as AI develops over time and is already, in effect, happening. But it's not totally clear why the change in difference between the easiness of spreading misinformation prior to and post large language models is particularly important, because misinformation was already pretty widespread. So even if their argument is completely right, it's just not totally clear what the contribution to the debate actually achieves. This is somewhat similar to a tipping point thing, but frequently it can be used in more effective ways by not even necessarily introducing a tipping point, just making it so that it doesn't seem like their contribution to the impact is all that huge. Third, you can do an impact side flip. And yes, I know this is confusing because, as I mentioned, there are 2 impact flips that you're doing that you could potentially do. For some reason, despite these being noticeably different, they're frequently both just referred to as flipping an argument. An impact side flip is to say that their argument happens on your side to a degree, and you can pick the degree. This is different from washing the motion, because washing the motion says, or washing the clash, says that there are effects on either side of the house that lead to this being horribly unlikely or almost certain regardless. How do you do this? Imagine you're making an argument in the opposite direction they are. So, for example, maybe they say that it's good for the economy. You might say, no, it's actually quite bad for the economy for these 3 independent mechanisms. They say it saves lives. You say, no, it kills lives. That it kills people. That sort of thing. Another thing that you need to do with these is just to weigh or do the logical implication of the analysis you're providing. So if you prove their metric more, then explain why that's the case. And if you prove their metric less, then explain what that does to the debate. Probably, it means that the change is more marginal here than it is somewhere else, which is the focus of your case, maybe. Or maybe, even though you prove it less, you prove it for a group which is so uniquely important that it doesn't matter that you access their metric somewhat less than they do. Side note, given all of these refutational options, there are a number of ones that run in tension with one another that you should be careful to not deliver both of at the same time in a speech. So what are those tensions? The first tension is running truth-based rebuttal and washing rebuttal. So if you make arguments as to why their argument is not true, and therefore, by logical conclusion, they don't reach their impacts, and then explain why the impact actually happens on both sides for factors outside of the motion, these are obviously in tension with one another. There is a way around this tension. You can explain that the fact that the impact is uncomparative means both sides get to achieve the aim that they set out for, but they don't get any marginal advantage in it, or not enough of a marginal advantage for it to matter. But be wary of that tension. The second tension, similar logic, is impact negation and washing rebuttal. Roughly, it has the same fix as well. Third tension, flipping the impact twice. If you explain that the impact is actually bad rather than good, but you also get it on your side, well, that's not great. Similarly, if you flip the value of the impact and then provide rebuttal that washes it to be on both sides, you're at that point doing counterproductive work. Fourth tension, if you flip the value of an impact and then do work to explain why the impact never manifests, there's an obvious tension here. There are two ways to get around this. The first is even ifing. So if their impact manifests in the first place, it is actually bad, but it's unlikely to actually manifest. The second is just by being nuanced. So the impact rarely manifests because of a refutation, but in the one instance in which it does manifest, it is particularly bad for these nuanced reasons we'll give. The final tension I want to highlight is just make sure that you aren't running rebuttal that is in tension with your own substantive material, that rebuts your own case, that makes you look weaker in the round. Second side note, please treat refutation like an argument. It needs accompanying analysis as to why the refutation is true. Frequently, it will have internal burdens, just like a normal argument, which each needs accompanying analysis. Please don't just counter-assert. You need to give reasons as to why your refutation is true. Third side note, and we'll come back to this momentarily, but make sure that you always explain what the point of the refutation that you delivered was. Well, we've run up against a problem. There are 3 teams that you need to reduce the persuasiveness of, and you are only one team. So how can we time efficiently reduce other teams' persuasiveness? Refutation cannot be the answer because it only takes down one team at an individual point in time. The answer to this is a fewfold. The first is prioritization. The other 3 are logical positioning, framing, and weighing. So logical positioning first. While logical positioning may only target one team, its goal is to position you above all the teams that team was beating by accepting the best case of all their material, which is far more time efficient than refuting each of them individually. The second, on framing, framing shifts the debate from what previous arguments had focused on. This is particularly potent with good speakers because it is much easier to shift the focal point of the debate than to rebut logically well-constructed arguments. In effect, framing the debate to a new context or a new focal point is highly effective mitigatory rebuttal to an extent. Their point won't disappear, but it will become considerably less relevant than it was when they made it. When you deploy a compelling frame, it directly positions it above all the material that was delivered by other debaters, which makes it a very time-efficient way of winning against multiple teams. Finally, weighing. In mini debates, multiple teams will contribute to one clash or have similar impacts, which makes weighing a fairly time-efficient way of beating multiple teams. And, in the sense that weighing, when done well, puts you above the best-case version of a different team, it is far more time-efficient than refutation, which tries to take down their best-case version. The second answer is just prioritization, as you can see on screen. It turns out that not everything needs to be refuted, so rather only 2 things really need to be taken out for your case to win the debate. First, rather obviously, the things that are more important or plausibly more important than your material. And second, the things that stand in the way of your material. And this can be even implicitly. It doesn't have to be something that was explicitly said as standing in the way of it. So, for example, if you want to run an argument which says Putin will go to war with NATO countries, even if he knows the results will not be in his favor, but every other team has operated as though Russia only makes decisions in its rational interest as a nation, then you need to effectively refute the assumption and explain why it is that Putin has particular interests or pressures which will lead him to act in the way that you want. The third answer here is targeting prioritization. So prioritization again. Presuming that you and your opponent are equally good debaters, when you refute a point to legitimately do damage to the built-up analysis you want to do, you probably have to spend as much time or more than the debater who constructed the point spent on it. So, for example, if opening government spends 6 minutes thoroughly analyzing why it is that even after a ban on junk food, there would be lots of demand for junk food, and all of this time was legitimately spent proving this in various different ways, you would probably have to spend as much time or longer to disprove this. And rather obviously, this would be an inefficient use of your time. However, assuming that they were making a black market argument and did no analysis as to why there would still be junk food providers, you can spend a very, very short period of time explaining that there would be no or not many providers for various reasons and take that point out in its entirety. So that sort of targeting prioritization is a good way of doing more efficient refutation. The same is true for cases that don't miss burdens. So for example, if they spend 5 minutes talking about the first thing, 1 minute talking about the second thing, then the thing that you should target is the second thing. But it's also the case that very frequently there are hidden assumptions that are required for their point to be true, and targeting those, since they deliver no analysis on them, very obviously is the most efficient way of dealing with the case. The fourth answer is refutation prioritization. So this is, what do you weaponize against them? You should focus on delivering only the most devastating pieces of rebuttal that you have, though sometimes devastating rebuttal can shoot too high, and it makes sense, as we'll talk about in a bit, to hedge by launching less damaging, more believable rebuttal as well. On a related note, where should you place your refutation? My answer is that any of the following 3 options are totally fine as long as you are cognizant of the risks that are associated with them. The first is just front-loaded rebuttal. And front-loaded rebuttal is generally the safest option because if there are very important things in the debate or things in the way of your case, then you know that judges will pay attention to your refutation if you put it at the front and deal with it first. And also, it means that judges will be paying more attention to your case afterwards because they'll go, well, now I don't implicitly feel like this thing is standing in the way of this being true, and I'll flow with more detail because now they have access to their impact instead of you doing it later, which risks judges not paying as much attention to the analysis they required to have something out of the way for it first. However, it runs 2 risks. The first is just that frequently you end up doing redundant things and wasting time later on in the speech by accidentally refuting again or doing the same sort of thing internal to an argument, and so sometimes it can be a bit of a time waster in your speeches. The second is that it reduces the time for constructive delivery, so frequently constructive portions of speeches are the most important portions of speeches, and in those instances, if you front load 3 minutes of refutation and you go, I did not mean to front load 3 minutes of refutation, now my 5-minute case I don't have time to get through entirely, well, that's just not great. However, as I mentioned, it is most likely to be credited and safest. The second place that you can put rebuttal is integrated to your positive material. I think this risks a couple of things. The first is just, in many instances, you don't actually legitimately integrate rebuttal into your constructive. You just kind of say it as a way to avoid doing refutation, and dropping arguments is generally not a good thing. The second is, many times that you do this, if you don't flag where the refutation is and how it interacts with the other cases, you likely won't get credited by your judges because judges are just going to miss it as you're going through your constructive material. So this is corrected fairly easily by flagging clearly, but that's something to work on and something that makes this a more efficient way of doing refutation. However, it does bring with it the benefit of reduced redundancy risk, so you're probably not going to go over the same refutation twice if you're just going through your constructive and flagging where it interacts. The third option is backloaded rebuttal. So this carries a primary risk of just time management in the sense that it may be the case that you realize, well, I don't have time to actually get to all of this refutation that was very important at the end of the speech. This is something that I myself have done many, many times, and it is a risk that doing this form of refutation carries with it. But as a benefit, it can set up weighing very well. So if you want to do weighing at the very end of your speech, comparing your total case against their total case, then doing refutation right before weighing can often be very effective. Well, what if I'm the PM? Every role has a rebuttal advantage over me, right? Wrong. PMs can increase efficacy by preempting. I think most people think of preemption as they'll say X, this is wrong, and then launch into some sort of logic-based rebuttal. But this is generally not very recommendable. Rather, Preemption primarily looks like anticipating the impacts they will reach and proving the opposite of them. There are a couple of other ways to do preemption we'll talk about in the 4th day of workshops, but flagging that for then. Effectively, what you're doing is you're making it more difficult for them to clearly win on the thing that you think they will run, which reduces the risk of them just maneuvering around your preemptions, and it also reduces time wasting by preempting material that doesn't come up, because now you're constructing positive material for your own side, regardless of whether or not it actually clashes very deeply with the material that they end up running. Now that we know all of these tools for reducing other teams' persuasiveness, how do we safeguard against them in our speeches so as to increase the time that it takes other teams to deliver material that is as compelling as ours? Primarily, go down the response chain. Ask, what things exist that render your impact parallel? And despite those, why is the change in your impact still an important change? Because there are two kinds of impacts in debate. They are either unique or marginal. So, a unique impact is something like you're creating a thing that didn't exist in the world prior to it. But a marginal impact is people, say, already have money, but potentially your benefit could increase the amount of money they have. The problem is, the vast majority of impacts are impacts that are marginal. They're contributing to something that previously existed already and just upping the level of that thing. It's horribly difficult to come up with something that is truly unique that will happen as a result of any debate motion, where there are always 999 factors that sit outside the debate's purview. Which means that very frequently, if you just impact out to a thing saying this thing happens, that thing can be said to be uncomparative. So what you have to do is you have to figure out why the difference between where the thing was at and where it is at after the debate is a difference that is impactful and meaningful. That is like a very complex yet quite easy concept to understand. It's complex to actually put into practice, and it's something you should focus on, because at the point that you start actually doing this, your impacts and lines of argumentation will become so much more difficult to actually refute. And just to credit where credit is due, I took basically that entire example from a workshop that is in the sources. The second way of doing preemption is to characterize actors to try to avoid hidden burdens. So why are things likely to be the way that your case needs them to be? Why are your characterizations true, if not in every case, in the vast majority of cases? And why do decision-making figures act in the way that you say they do? For example, what are their competing incentives, and why don't those outweigh their incentives to do what you say they're going to do? The third thing is to preempt the tipping point stuff. So why do you not reach a tipping point or need to reach a tipping point for your arguments to matter? Why do you reach the specific tipping point, why do you reach the specific tipping points required for an impact? And why is it good to increase the chance of this impact happening regardless of whether or not a tipping point is actually reached? Fourth, why is your impact not trivial if it could plausibly be characterized as trivial? If it's the sort of FOMO thing that we talked about before, why is this something that either should weigh on people or does weigh on people in a meaningful way? And why can people not adapt to this thing over time, for example? There are other ways to make arguments trivial, but you get the point. Additionally, it is frequently worth preemptively weighing your arguments. Why are the metrics that you are winning on, that your argument is best at, going to be the most important considerations in the debate? Even as the Prime Minister, presuming that you have a decent view of how the debate will turn out, you should be trying to do this. Okay, so it turns out the judges are not perfect, ordinary, intelligent voter machines. Rather, they have a somewhat blurry view of the debate, which means that you can effectively pull one over on them. This has a number of implications for things that we've already covered, and it also means that weighing and logical positioning and framing are particularly important. Specifically though, this gives us a fifth way to improve our standing in the debate. That is, to make our judges believe that our material, is more persuasive than other teams' material. There are a number of ways that you can do this. The first is just to try to reduce the cognitive load of your adjudicators, which is actually the second that I put on here. I did this so out of order. So there are a couple of ways, there are many different ways actually that you can go about this. So let's go through them. The first is just the start of your arguments is a very important place. It has disproportionate sway over whether or not the judge is persuaded by the argument, and it should be used strategically. How can we use the start of our argument to ensure that judges pay attention and to simultaneously reduce their cognitive load? A number of ways. The first is that you can signal what the argument is about. So what happens, how does it happen, what is the impact of it happening, and why is that particularly important? The second is that you can go, and all of that are, like, those are things you'll prove in the argument, but frequently it's worthwhile to state them at the top. The second is that you can go over the basics of the argument so that the judge can track and confirm rather than trying to figure out if you proved everything you needed to. So just, and this is very similar, what are the steps that we're going to take in this argument so that the judges can be like, ah, yeah, they're making it through this, cool, rather than trying to figure out the individual burdens of proof themselves. The third, while not related to the start, try to regularly signpost where it is that you are. And this is, again, not related to the start of arguments, but it's quite helpful, especially if you pair it with the previous things you're doing as well, just to make sure the judge knows where you are with respect to the things you said at the start of the argument. So not just with numbers, also with reference to the parts of speech that you're under. So for example, this is the second reason that this does X if it's been a second since you said what the first reason for it was and you've been doing a bunch of analysis per se. The second thing you can do to reduce the cognitive load is just to explain what it is that your refutation achieves and what exactly it was that you were rebutting. So, general rule of thumb, if you cannot identify why it is that you're delivering the rebuttal that you're delivering, that is, in what ways it contributes directly to you winning the round, you probably shouldn't deliver the refutation. Presuming that you can, then it's worthwhile to tell the judges along with the rebuttal itself as to what the rebuttal is doing. Are you attacking a core impact? What are the implications if you're doing that? Are you flipping their advantage? Are you reducing their impact? If so, why does it matter that it's reduced? All of this sort of stuff. Treat this like importance analysis, but internal to the debate at hand. That is, what was the importance of your refutation with regards to the debate that is happening? Quick tangent. Now that you have all the tools I want you to have with regards to refutation, the ideal piece of refutation looks something like the following. And to be clear, I'm stealing this fairly directly from one of the videos that I attached as a source, because I think it is amazingly put in that video. First, frame the opponent's argument. So restate it charitably, but lay bare the mechanism or assumption that you're going to attack. Second, explain what it is that you're doing to the argument. Is it a flip? Is it mitigating the impact? Then is it explaining why the logic doesn't work? Third, deliver analysis that serves the purpose of the second step. Explain the implications of what it was that you delivered. That is, where does this argument fit into the round? What is it that it does to the argument that you attacked that puts it below yours? Does it have an impact on the rest of the debate, maybe? That sort of thing. And here's an important note. Draw out implications on other comparatives too. So maybe opening government couldn't respond to this particular argument from opening opposition, but you could. And this argument happens to beat opening government's material. So if so, your response puts you above opening opposition and opening government, and you should highlight that to the judges. Let's do a worked example of this. Suppose that you are the opening opposition under the motion, this House would ban private schools. And government has argued that private schools allow rich families to buy better education, which entrenches class inequality because wealthy children get better teachers, networks, university preparation, and career outcomes. Banning private schools forces rich families back into the public system and turns them into political pressure for improving public schools generally. And we're going to presume that they've done a decent job with all of this. The first thing to do is to frame the argument. So government argues that private schools are a major mechanism by which wealthy families entrench generational inequality, and that, on the comparative, wealthy individuals will put their zero-sum resources into improving public schooling for everyone. Notice the framing here. I'm pointing out the implicit assumption that this is a primary mechanism for entrenching class inequality in this particular way in the first sentence. And in the second, I'm bringing in a characterization of wealthy people that will weaponize momentarily. That is, that they have zero-sum access to resources. Returning to framing. But this argument depends on one crucial assumption, that once private schools are banned, rich parents will rejoin and use their resources to improve the same public school systems as everyone else. This exposes exactly what it is that I'm going to attack with my refutation. Second, explain what you are doing to the argument. So it's not that private schools are not unequal, it's just that on the comparative, things are unlikely to get much more equal on either side of the house. We say, instead, that the inequality only relocates into a less visible form. Third, deliver analysis to that point. Rich people have multiple substitute mechanisms to preserve their advantage. For example, many will move to expensive school districts where, because of property tax distributions, schools are already known to be or considered fancy. Since school quality is roughly tied to geography, banning private schools just shifts competition from tuition markets into housing markets. Wealthy parents bid up property near the best public schools, driving out low-income tenants who got lucky enough to live there for a long period of time, and ensuring that these same children still get access to better education that is unequal. Second, they are far more likely to spend their zero-sum resources on private enrichment outside of school because it is a far more cost-efficient use of their money. They purchase tutoring, exam preparation, music lessons, sports coaching, university admissions consulting from private entities. Notably, these things are harder to regulate than schools because they are fragmented across markets and therefore considerably less visible. Third, their students crowd out zero-sum spots on sports teams and gifted programs and special admissions pathways, etc. As a result, parents frequently don't feel the pressure to spend money or political will on improving the school system writ large because their student is already excelling. Fourth, you explain the implications, or the fourth thing that we're talking about with regards to the structure. We prove that banning private schools does not reduce educational inequality. At most, it removes a highly visible form of it and replaces it with a much less visible form. This refutation matters for three reasons. First, it mitigates their primary impact. The educational gap does not close by much if it closes at all, and therefore, our much more clearly comparative impact of whatever it is that you're running is far more important. Second, it flips their argument. We provided two independent mechanisms as to how this actually crowds out lower income folks and increases educational inequality, which means even by their metric of educational equality, we win the debate. Third, it puts us ahead on the comparative. We can accept that private schools produce inequality, but our world allows the state to regulate that inequality directly. So even if you believe the debate on inequality is a wash, our side is better able to actually respond to it. Returning to refutation writ large, there's a sub-implication here. It is frequently difficult as a judge to tell who is winning a point. It might be the case that you deliver truly stellar refutational analysis on a particular point that is far better than the material that they gave, but it ends up being undercredited just because of judge imperficacy. You can help avoid this by weighing your refutation. So why is it that your interpretation is the likely one rather than theirs? Don't just leave it up to the judge to decide the they said, we said clash. Let's use the second implication from the last worked example to work through this. How might we weigh these mechanisms with the opposing mechanisms? We might weigh on vulnerability in two ways. The first, we might say that you create a stronger incentive for rich people to move out of middle lower class neighborhoods where they might have previously been located by happenstance, but in those instances had access to a rich private school regardless. This means that you decrease the funding for many lower income areas, decreasing educational quality. Even if we increase educational equality for already mid to higher income areas, that evening out is considerably less important than the damage that we dealt, because they have access to fallback mechanisms, for example, family with wealth, etc. The second thing we might say is that the people priced out of places where suddenly there is a race to move are the people who need access to educational equality the most, because clearly they are the most vulnerable people there, which means that if they lose access to the previously decent quality education there. Okay, moving on. The last note on things that you can do to reduce your judge's cognitive load is comparative analysis. Comparative analysis is particularly important. It shows the difference between the sides and reduces the work the judges have to do to see that difference and to see its importance. You can give comparative analysis for a number of purposes. For one, you could do mechanistic comparative analysis. This is why they don't have access to the mechanisms that you are using. You can do refutational comparative analysis. So why the criticism that you're levying at their arguments cannot reasonably be levied at your own, which is especially valuable in debates where both sides agree on what is good and the majority of contention happens with the process to get there. And you can do impact access comparative analysis. So what are the differences in level of access to impacts? You can also do weighing criteria comparative analysis, that is, the difference in level of access to the particular criteria you're focused on, and also you should always remember to follow up all of these with why the difference actually matters. The second thing you can do to reduce the cognitive load is to prioritize rebuttal that requires the fewest mental steps for the judge to buy. It is very difficult to follow complicated arguments, And complex rebuttal is the exact same. So even if you deliver very good, complicated refutation that takes out a point well, judges frequently won't credit it. And it is worth pointing out that judges tend to have a lower standard for refutation. And by that I mean, like, if I'm a judge and I'm listening to you refute an argument, I will just tune out if I think there are way too many steps involved in the refutation. But if I'm listening to you construct an argument, I might try to follow, even if I'm like not paying quite as close attention as I otherwise would be. The third thing that you can do to make judges believe you more is deliver some of the refutation which in a perfect debate makes no sense to deliver. So, for example, pointing out holes in the logic which a perfect judge would spot, or delivering frequently very brief refutation to arguments that are not as persuasive as yours, even if it is clear that they're not as persuasive as yours. Additionally, layering rebuttal becomes very important because it hedges against the chance that judges won't buy one piece of rebuttal or the other. General recommended structure for this is to layer in the following way, in the way that we said at the start of refutation. The fourth thing is that it means that you should hedge against the best case of their arguments in case the judge overcredits them. The TLDR of all of those is that it means that the point of refutation itself shifts. So previously, the best piece of rebuttal was the piece of rebuttal which either eliminated the argument you were rebutting or reduced the size of its importance to less than the size of your constructed material. The second of these objectives now is to reduce the size to no longer being plausibly larger than the size of your construction material, which involves clarity in what you're doing and likely slightly over-rebutting. The fifth thing that you should do to make your judges believe you more is make sure that you're not giving your judges any easy outs to say that your material is not as persuasive as it should be. What are some ways that you can avoid this? The first, as we've mentioned already, is to not exaggerate your impact beyond what you proved. Impacts should be using the argument you proved and specifying how many people are affected by it, how intensely they are affected, in what way they are affected, and what the comparative looks like for them. Overshooting is bad in the sense that it frequently delegitimizes the persuasiveness of material that otherwise should be very persuasive. So, for example, if you say that we solve for climate change, even if you have reasonable analysis as to how you legitimately make the harms of climate change considerably less bad, judges are just not going to pay attention to it because you labeled it incorrectly and their brain turns off at the point that they hear a debater go for the 100th time, we're solving for climate change. The second thing here is just do not leave an impact not visualizable. So, for example, that would look like saying, this will improve the economy. What does that mean? Since a large factor in judge decisions is the status, that is the vulnerability, your obligations to, etc., to the impacted group, leaving an impact at an unhumanized level loses out on any explicit gain that you could have in driving it to an actual humanized connection or conclusion. The weighing process also becomes more difficult as likelihood and magnitude are implicitly or explicitly left in the air if it isn't humanized. And this is an important note. Judges legitimately give teams considerably more points because they reduce the cognitive load on them. Like, if you tell a judge that the metric they should decide this debate on is likelihood, and give good analysis as to why, even if there are other plausibly more important metrics that could be the deciding factor of the debate, judges will generally favor yours as long as there is no competing analysis, simply because you've reduced their cognitive burden with regards to particular comparisons. Again, the questions to ask are, for impacts, 1, who is affected, 2, in what ways are they affected, and 3rd, what do they look like on the other side of the debate. If this happens to leave you at a still non-humanized end, so maybe it's that universities get better because they're more well-funded, try to go a step further in the same 2 questions. At the point that you get to a humanized end, for example, better education for people with low geographic mobility that are frequently funneled into public schools, ask yourself whether there is any ambiguousness and whether or not that is a good thing. If there is, then reduce it by illustrating why the thing is good or explaining logically why it leads to better impacts or good impacts. So for example here, even though I think this is quite an uncontentious end, you might explain what it looks like for a student who previously believed they didn't have a post-higher education path because their nearest public university had horribly low post-grad employment rates. Or you might explain that this means that people will be better able to form employment-relevant skills and therefore will have expanded job opportunities. You should try to overcorrect on this at first and then reel it back in once you've got a good grip on the sorts of things that generally go uncontested. Third thing here for hedging against worst-case interpretation of your own arguments is just to not leave impacts as, this could happen, explain why it is likely to happen. Similarly, always prove incentive and capacity for anything that requires an actor's involvement. Fourth, compare your weakest version with their strongest version. So try to come up with why, in your worst world, you still beat their arguments if the best debater in the world had made those arguments. A couple other strategies for hedging against the worst case interpretation of your arguments. First, on impacting, you can do 10-80-10 things. So what is the worst case of the impact? That is the most severe harm, that is somewhat unlikely, most likely. Second, what does the impact look like in the majority of instances, so the median to maybe like closer to the extremes? And third, what is the worst case for you? So what is the instance in which the impact hardly doesn't happen at all? Or maybe it just doesn't happen at all. Maybe try place setting, try explaining how your arguments pan out in various distinct contexts from one another. For example, in developing countries, this looks like this, and in developed countries, it looks like this other thing, or under different political systems, or in different social movements, or whatever. Make sure if you are using this strategy to hedge against the worst case interpretation, you are explaining conditions that actually meaningfully affect the impact itself, and not just redundantly being like, in developing countries it looks like this, and in developed countries it looks like the exact same thing, but in developed countries, because that's unhelpful. Additionally, frequently, it is worth doing immediate term, short term, and long term analysis on the impacts that you provide. What is the immediate, that's self-explanatory. Fourth, impact scaling is quite useful. And this isn't what I was talking about earlier with impact scaling, where you're trying to scale your impacts to the argument you're making. This is saying, the low burden impact first. So maybe people feel safer as a result of your argument about tough on crime policies, regardless of whether or not those tough on crime policies actually succeed. Moving on to a medium burden claim, so maybe some crime is deterred, to a higher burden claim. Maybe even crime networks have an increased potential to collapse. Notice what you're doing here. Be careful not to say that this policy results in them collapsing. Rather, it is increasing the potential for them to collapse, because judges will write the first one off. Additionally, you can point out second-order effects. So in any debate where people get money, they consume more, they invest more. The money multiplier means that macroeconomic stimulus is likely to occur as long as it happens on a large enough scale. Maybe local businesses are more likely to succeed as they become less reliant on seasonal consumption changes and that sort of thing. Maybe that means that someone is able to buy art they find horribly meaningful that they couldn't have on the comparative because a particular store didn't close down. That last one's a bit absurd. But each impact always has ripple effects, and they are often worth considering these ripple effects within impacting your own arguments. Finally, illustrations. So illustrations are your bridges from abstract logical claims to a more concrete understanding of what those claims actually manifest as. And you can frequently scam judges if you have decent analysis just by having very good examples, as I talked about at the top. You can also make impacts and link chains seem far more likely just through providing examples of them actually happening. They are importantly not things that replace explanations. Ideally, they illustrate them rather than replace them. And to be clear, by examples here, I don't mean literal things that have happened. I just mean hypothetical scenarios that put your judges in two particular shoes, those being the people impacted or a situation that occurred elsewhere. Okay. I think this is the final thing on hedging against the worst case interpretation. Yes, I believe so. Try doing mechanism impacting. So that is adding impacts to every step of your argument. Impacts do not have to go out at the end of argumentation. Very frequently, you can build mechanisms that have impacts themselves. And it is generally worth pointing out how these impacts interact with the other side when they clearly do so. But it's also generally not worth weighing these impacts because they're kind of just miscellaneous thorns to an argument. If you think of an argument like a blackberry bush for a moment, these are things that poke out along the way of that argument, which means they're very useful for first speakers because if the other side takes out a large portion of your argument concretely, your second speaker can go, but look at how big and painful this particular thorn is that they didn't reach with their refutation. Okay, before getting into this question, let's talk about time efficiency, because you don't have unlimited time to go through all of these, so how do you select what to prioritize? The first is just that you should select impacts that align with your weighing strategy, because this makes things easier on you at the end because you have a clear way of weighing your impacts against other teams' impacts. Also try to select impacts which are more unique to your side, because these are just easier to weigh because the difference is more noticeable. And third, Select impacts which are easy to make preemptive of opposing impacts. So, for example, democratic accountability impacts in a debate about technocracy versus democracy. You can make their likely best impact of efficiency, one, contingent on yours, in the sense that if people do not feel that the state is democratically accountable, maybe they will be less inclined to help it function in the ways that technocrats need, and two, and more importantly, because this is better analysis, preempted by the principled claim that we value democracy for what it is, not whether or not it results in efficient or good outcomes. The fourth thing to prioritize on impacts is just impacts that affect particularly vulnerable groups. This is a good rule of thumb for prioritization within illustrations too. You probably don't need to illustrate how Elon Musk or some rich person is affected by most motions. So one strategy that I've never really tried to hedge against the worst case interpretation is just explicitly preempting judge misinterpretation, and it might be worth giving that a shot. So, for example, this would look like, we aren't saying this, we're saying that. Or you might think, but actually, yeah, that sort of thing. Okay, well, how can you make your material more compelling? A few strategies for this. First, detail. Adding in unnecessary detail looks, at first, time inefficient, but it can make your case feel considerably more robust. A good example of a way to do this is to use the specific capital, city, of a particular country when referring to it for international relations debates. So Moscow, or the Kremlin instead of Russia, Kiev instead of Ukraine, Beijing instead of China, Pyongyang instead of North Korea, that sort of thing. Relatedly, characterizations add a lot of believability to arguments. So there are at least 3 places where you can add detail to make things more plausible. This is frequently referred to as world building. The first is to the mechanism. So let's do an example. Say you have the motion, this house would significantly reduce corporate taxes. The first version of an argument that you could give is that, and this is a very reasonable argument, businesses will have more money to spend, and wanting a return on that money, they'll invest it more, leading to productivity growth. But you could give this argument in a different way. You could say, most firms operate on razor-thin margins and prioritize short-term returns because of quarterly evaluations and constant, intense competitive pressures. So, when taxes decrease, the increase in earnings retention are typically reinvested into things that improve productivity. I think this version of the argument is far more plausible, but it has another important advantage. Where previously the argument was somewhat flimsy on account of it being challengeable via context, now, to challenge the argument itself, other debaters will have to challenge a compelling contextual characterization, which makes it considerably more difficult to take down. How do you come up with this? Ask what the contexts you want to exist to support your mechanisms are, and then explain why those contexts are the case. Additionally, you can frequently just go down the response chain. So what are the likely objections to your argument, and then build in characterizations to avoid those objections. So, for example, if you're running an argument which is contingent on sanctions functioning, 2 of the most likely responses to this point are 1, that the target country is not economically vulnerable to sanctions, that it is connected to supply chains which allow it to get around sanctions easily, or it has the internal capacity to be self-sufficient or whatever. And 2, that sanctions will never translate to real pressure because the political structure is insulated from them. An argument then about sanctions working in this context should weave in at least those characterizations. So why is it that the country prefers or is dependent in some meaningful way on access to Western markets? And why is it that the political structure is not insulated from the pressure exerted by sanctions? You can also add characterizations to the involved actors. So by this I mean primarily in a way which narrows the set of relevant actors by explaining which sorts of characteristics you primarily care about. So for example, if the motion is this house would ban targeted political advertising on social media, one version of an argument you can make is that voters will be less influenced by political ads, so elections become fairer. But you could alternatively give this argument in the following way. Voters will be less influenced by political ads, particularly low information swing voters who are politically disengaged, yet frequently the deciding constituency in elections. These are voters who do not actively seek out information on their own, and so are disproportionately influenced by emotionally salient messaging that happens to find them. Removing targeted ads reduces the precision and repetition of this messaging to this subset of voters specifically, which lowers the ability to manipulate them. So this narrows the debate to the effects on these sorts of swing voters, and presuming that you gave better analysis than that as to why they're the key group to care about in the debate, this is a good way of narrowing the actual context in which the debate takes place. This also serves a secondary purpose that we'll cover tomorrow, but being specific with who is involved in your arguments makes judges more inclined to believe them. Additionally, you can add characterization to the world around your arguments. I'm in the way of that. That's okay. Since people have an inclination to believe more detailed claims, providing information about the context that would stay the same on both sides, or value-neutral claims supposedly, can be compelling in the sense that it supercharges your case, and in the sense that it makes your story more plausible just in the fact that it is more of a detailed story. So, for example, maybe your motion is about passing a particular policy that a certain social movement is a fan of. If you can convincingly claim that the social movement that supports the policy has seen rapid growth in popular support recently, but is yet to institutionalize any of its wins, this is something that doesn't necessarily add anything to the debate for either side, but can relatively easily be weaponized by you, i.e. by claiming that passing the policy would create a sort of virtuous cycle which leads to more success for the movement and more good policies, etc. Side note on this one, be careful, because this sort of analysis can easily render your impacts less comparative than they might be, e.g., why is it necessary to pass this policy if the social movement is already growing in popular support? So make sure that you're doing this in a strategic manner, not both. Second side note, one of the most compelling ways to deliver a case is to provide a few contextual specifics and then explain how it is that your mechanisms interact with those pieces. So for example, if the motion is this House would adopt proportional representation in national elections, you could first add neutral characterizations. For example, in many democracies, voter dissatisfaction with mainstream parties is reaching a crisis point, and then explain the mechanism and how it interacts with that. So that would be, in this instance, voters in proportional representation systems are far less likely to be afraid to vote for the parties that they want, because they are less afraid that doing so is a vote against the lesser of evils party that they would vote for under winner-take-all systems. And then the third step would be to explain how this interacts with the context. So in this instance, the latent demand for these non-mainstream parties can actually be actualized, resulting in an avoidance of any results that the crisis you lined out at the top would lead to, and a democratic landscape that is just much more representative of existing preferences that are already there, but not yet able to be actualized. The second thing you could do to make your material more persuasive is just illustrations. We've talked about these on end, but adding an illustration to the end of everything makes it far more plausible. Third, you can layer things. Layering serves two purposes with regards to making material more compelling. The first is that judges are more inclined to believe logical steps that have more than one reason behind them. Just real quick, to illustrate why it is that having more than one reason for something is frequently very compelling, let's take the example. I might tell you that a recession is quite likely because consumer demand is collapsing. I think that is far less compelling than saying a recession is likely for 4 reasons. First, because retail spending is down. Second, because credit card delinquency rates are rising. Third, because household savings are shrinking. And fourth, because wage growth is stalling. I think you probably feel much more inclined to believe me in the second situation, but it just so happens that the 4 independent reasons I just gave there are all things that are consumed or part of the statement, a recession is likely because consumer demand is collapsing. And so, frequently, it can be worth explaining 4 different ways through which something occurs just to have a sort of redundancy that makes it more compelling to judges. Because humans do have a psychological tendency of, 1, to believe things that are more detailed, as frequently having different reasons for things forces you to do, and 2, to believe things that have more reasons as to why they are true, more than the same thing that has one, say, larger including reason as to why it is true. So, for example, if you want to make the claim that people will be overworked regardless of a narrative which glorifies overworking, you might say, first, frequently you overwork yourself out of economic necessity. In many instances, especially for low-income individuals, normal hours just aren't enough, and you have to pick up as much extra as you can. Second, in many positions, you feel an obligation to overwork yourself. So hospitals, schools, nonprofits, etc., all are frequently understaffed and have a moral urgency to their work, which you probably feel if you voluntarily went into these fields in the first place. Third, frequently, overworking looks like adding on additional, maybe non-primary job-related responsibilities because you want to do things like resume build, because you want to get into that graduate program of your dreams, because you just have to take on a few extra hours by doing this extra job that would be overworking yourself. You probably now feel pretty compelled that a large number of people will overwork themselves regardless of the narrative in this debate. What if I added the following 2 reasons? Fourth, many workers lack the ability to refuse extra hours because they fear being fired, denied a promotion, or being punished informally for it. And fifth, that in many professions, the norm is to overwork regardless of its glorification, and working normally looks like underworking relative to your employers or to your other employees. Take, for example, junior lawyers and doctors. Maybe the fourth is mildly more compelling, but I'm guessing that at the point that I've added the 5th reason for this, you basically don't feel any more persuaded by the argument. And this illustrates something important. The more logical reasons that you give for something, the less important the next logical reason becomes with regards to persuading the truth value of the overarching statement. There's probably a considerable change 80% of the time or so between 1 and 2 compelling reasons, and probably still more often than not another considerable change between 2 and 3. But after that point, it kind of drops off very precipitously. And delivering more logical reasons, notably, has a distinct opportunity cost, both in the sense that it likely trades off with the quality of the reasons you deliver, and in the more objectively true sense that you have to spend time doing it that you could spend on other things which would be more productive, like efficient refutation weighing, etc. Well, you might object, if I provide 6 reasons as to why this logical step is true, I know that the other team won't bother to refute at this point because it would be absurd of them to spend all the requisite time necessary to do so. Yeah, this strategy could potentially pay off. And in very narrow debates, in debates where there is really only one clash, it very well might. But a smart team opposing you will find ways to efficiently refute your point regardless, attacking maybe the framing of the point instead of the mechanisms. 6 reasons as to why something is true does nothing to analysis that says, well, yeah, this thing that you proved is actually true on both sides of the debate. Maybe even they'll choose to rebut one of the mechanisms and show why the rebuttal they delivered to that has damning implications on the rest of your material. And if you delivered 3 reasons as to why something is true, do you really think that they would go out of their way to rebut all 3 of those reasons? If they did, maybe it's better for you because it means they've wasted more of their speech. The point is, while this does illustrate a reason to have more than 1 and frequently more than 2 mechanisms for any given logical leap, the marginal returns still drop off pretty heavily after the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th reason for something. My recommendation is to ask yourself, if you plan to deliver more than 3 reasons for a thing, explicitly what each additional reason is doing and why you would want to do that. So if it isn't part of some path to victory that you have planned, or it doesn't damage other teams particularly intensely, then it's not really worth running the additional reasons. There's a very real failure case here too. Frequently debates will have many reasons just for the sake of having many reasons that are not truly logically distinct from one another. Arguably, my 4th and 5th reason from the last example were kind of that. Generally, this is unadvisable and a waste of time because they have the same logic. Teams can just get rid of them with the same analysis. And they also don't really compel the judges anymore. The same thing is true with regards to impacts. You can make impacts feel considerably larger just by dividing them up. Let's say you wanted to impact the housing crisis. You could say the housing crisis is bad for low-income people because it means that you are far less likely to ever be able to afford a home, which deprives you of a meaningful sense of security and weighs on you constantly throughout your life. This is a good impact, but it can be made stronger by isolating particular subdivisions of low-income people and explaining how they, based on their unique characterizations, are affected. So maybe if you're a retiree on a fixed income, the rising costs of rent, property taxes, homeowners insurance, and utilities all means that you experience tightened budgets. You're stressed about the future because there's very little that you personally can do to change the income that you're living on, etc. Maybe if you're a low-income college student, you have a longer commute, which means you get less out of your classes because you're more tired for them. You're less able to enjoy the college experience because your fixed costs are higher, and so you miss out on unique experiences because you have to work a job, etc. Maybe if you're a single mother, you have to take on more hours or add part-time jobs on, which means you get to spend less quality time with your children, which likely has compounding effects for them. Maybe for a sizable chunk of low-income folks, rising house prices represent literal unaffordability, and if you're lucky, this looks like being forced to move into a cramped home with family or friends, but in many instances, it can look like being forced into houselessness. Disregard the fact that my ordering on these was quite weird. The impact is now considerably more tangible and important feeling than it was to begin with. Additionally, you can segment impacts into different aspects. To be clear though, I think the example I just gave is not ideal to the extent that it is too segmented. We already talked about efficiently doing this, so refer back to that when talking about the efficiency here. One hilariously compelling strategy to make it feel like you are delivering more layers than you are is to say, there are many reasons this is the case. For one, give a reason. Additionally, give another reason, etc., or and so on. Because you can leave it sort of open-ended and feeling as if there are way more reasons that you delivered, but you just happen to stop there for time management's sake. And I think that is quite funny. Lots of debaters do it. It is genuinely, I do this. I think it's fun and it works well to make impacts feel slightly more impactful than they are without losing much word efficiency. Okay, finally, the final thing you can do to make your material more persuasive is storytelling. Ooh, real quick, I think that was a good example of the sorts of things that you should do in your speeches when you're very many layers deep on a specific subtopic that you wanted to talk about in your speech, being like, and the fourth reason that, again, that overarching claim is true is the following. Just, maybe worth flagging. So storytelling is a great way to make your case more compelling by treating it like a story of things playing out. I'm not very good at this, but I watched a workshop by someone who is very good at this, and the recommendation from that workshop is to try to weave it into your intro. So try to come up with concrete examples, or a concrete example, that represents your argument and ties your speech together conclusively. It should take 20 to 30 seconds, appear at the beginning, and frequently be referenced throughout the speech. Try to specify, similar with impacting, who is affected, what their life looks like, what they feel, what they see around them, and what changes under your argument. I think emotions are kind of required to succeed at this, so only do this if you feel rhetorically capable of doing so. Final thing that makes your material more persuasive is just, unfortunately, confidence and tone and word choice. Unfortunately, these have very real effects on how persuasive the judges find your content. One of the reasons that matter filing is very important, and also one of the reasons there's literally a debate accent, and why all of us say things very similarly, is because having that same confidence, tone, word choice, etc. makes it so that you appear like a better debater. Next question, how can you take less time to deliver compelling material? The first thing that you can do is to work on word efficiency. There are drills for this on the drill document. The second thing you can do is use intuition pumps. We've already covered this, but they are great for priming judges to reduce your analytical burden after them. And they are quite good for undergirding missing analysis and making things feel plausible faster than you otherwise would have to. Third, let's talk about prep time as an extension here. One of the most fruitful things that you can do to increase your time efficiency in round is to make prep time more efficient. Prep time is a predictive game. Your primary goal should be to predict how the debate will take place and either take the winning strategy or turn your line into a winning strategy based on that prediction. So a couple of recommendations with regards to prep. The first is that you should silent prep. Try spending the first few minutes of prep just thinking about the motion. Try to come up with obvious clashes and the best few arguments for each side. Clashes will generally be on three possible things, and to be clear, you should try and figure out what they are, like contextually, but the three primary clashes that come up are whether or not the motion achieves certain outcomes, whether or not these outcomes are good or bad, or which outcomes are the most important. Frequently, there is a more fundamental clash on what the world actually looks like as well with regards to the relevant pieces attached to the motion. A second thing is just illustration brainstorming. So one of the things that I found most helpful during prep is just taking a little bit of time to brainstorm illustrations of vague things, and to do the same thing for the impact layer of each argument. So, for example, if the motion was, this house supports pronatalist policies, I'd think about, what are the sorts of concrete pronatalist policies that I can use in illustrations, etc., and I think purposefully about coming up with advantageous ones for me, because you always want to win the connotation debate as well. This is a great example because rather obviously there are pronatalist policies that seem very bad, for example, reduced access to contraception, illegalization of abortion, etc., and also ones that seem very good, so for example, free childcare. Importantly, these examples shape the connotation of the debate, so flooding the illustration space with obviously awful examples of this policy can shift judges' opinions towards your side, as long as you don't go to the extreme examples of them. Additionally, sometimes doing this brainstorming process reveals a done well or done poorly clash. More on that in future videos, but it would be a good example here. Third thing is just after brainstorming, So who are the main actors or stakeholders relevant to the argument in general? What groups are they comprised of? Who and what do they influence? Who and what are they influenced by? What are their primary incentives? And you can and should do that all very repetitively. So how can you break down the subgroups of the subgroups further? Who influences, who stakeholders are influenced by? Of the stakeholders influenced by primary stakeholders, who and what are influenced by them, so on and so forth. Fourth, what things will realistically change as a result of the motion, and what relevant things won't. Of the things that will be changed by the motion, what are some plausible arguments as to why they won't actually be changed? Of the relevant things that won't, maybe what are some plausible arguments as to why they will? In any debate, as I mentioned, there are 99 million unknown factors outside of the debate which aren't changed and can be weaponized against the various comparatives that teams take up within the debate. Fifth, think about rebuttal to the obvious opposition arguments. This gives you a time advantage over them if they haven't incorporated that in rebuttal. More advanced, think about the responses to your rebuttal and what your response to it would be, so on and so forth down the response chain. Sixth, relatedly, go down the response chain. Specifically with regards to your own arguments, try to look for what I call true benefits and harms. That is, benefits or harms which are near certain to accrue on your side, even after the best case responses to arguments. Sixth, ask how you will weigh your arguments. So for example, if you want to run a low impact, high probability argument, you might build some rhetoric in that emphasizes the uncertainty of everything else in the debate. Seventh, ask how they will likely weigh their arguments. For example, if they have an argument that particularly obviously impacts out to vulnerable groups, explain how your argument also impacts those groups. Additionally, a truly amazing workshop by Ayal Moore is included in the supplemental material of this week. I would highly recommend watching it to make your prep much more efficient. Okay, the final thing that you can do to take less time to deliver good arguments is to work well with your partner. Try to do things like make plays, have frames/strategies/techniques that are useful for debating but are also situational and require you to be very coordinated, that you've planned in advance. Create shorthand names for these strategies so that you both can be on the same page when they have to happen in round and don't have to spend too much time discussing them. Try to divide what you can in round. So for example, when I was working with Ava didn't flow at all, and that was fully something that I had to do in the debate. If I saw something that would be in the way of the extension we had planned and prepped, I'd just point it out. Generally, you probably want a little bit more communication on flowing than that. For example, it probably would have been advantageous if Ava had looked at the flow that I was writing down, but my handwriting's too bad for anyone to read it, so who cares? The point is, create a standardized format with your partner. Maybe create standardized note-takings. That way you can read each other's shorthand, etc. Additionally, it is always worth trying out different speaker positions than you're used to because it improves your understanding of your partner's constraints and it will probably boost your performance, and it also prevents over-specialization to the point of skill atrophy, which is something that I have run into being a second speaker for so long. So far, we've treated you as a Laplace's demon of sorts. But you don't happen to have perfect information about the debate either. You've been busy writing notes and constructing your own case, which means that you have to hedge against yourself in two ways. First, you need to hedge against having missed material. You should assume the best of your opponents. If they delivered refutation to your partner that you thought was mediocre, treat it like the best case version of that refutation. Treat their arguments as though they were delivered by the best debater that you know of and respond to them as such. Second, you need to hedge against your own biases. Try to be cognitively aware of where you find things to be intuitively true and explain them more thoroughly if there's a chance that the thing that you're talking about is in one of those areas. I think the most distinct example of this is with regard to moral judgments. I think we frequently have very strong opinions about which things are obviously bad or obviously good, but that won't necessarily fly for all judges. And even if it does fly, it is far more compelling to explain things in more detail. So for example, frequently welfare debates will end up impacting to reduced inequality or wealth is distributed. And these might intuitively be good to you, but and maybe even for most people in debate, but it is far more compelling to work through how it is that reduced inequality is actually a good thing, because maybe it means that you reduce the stigma by allowing people of different wealth levels similar opportunities and shared spaces. Maybe it's just that the money given to someone less well off is more useful than the money given to someone who is rich, because they use it to buy food that they might otherwise struggle to afford, to enroll their children in daycare, and to not take hours off of their work, that sort of thing. It also means that you should train your listening and flowing capabilities. Beginning with listening. First, make a point of listening to legitimate. This is difficult, but do it. Bad online rounds with low audio quality. Insert yourself into the debate and try to sum up the arguments that were made by debaters better than they did themselves and more organizedly than they did. Second, listen to lots of online rounds in general. People have accents, and frequently that means that it is somewhat difficult to catch everything they say, but this is very much not a static truth. Listening to debaters with various accents makes you better at debating debaters with similar sounding accents. This is very important if you're planning to go to Worlds or do a bunch of online tournaments, because they draw in people from around the world, and judges are going to be used to listening to those folks talk, and therefore if you get to a point of being used to that, it is quite good for you as a debater. It's also just generally good for you, I think. Third, try to ramp up the speed at which you're listening to and flowing rounds slowly. So maybe start listening to debaters on 1 speed, or maybe even slower than that if you struggle to get everything that they're saying. So like 0.5, 0.75, etc. And every couple of weeks, ramp up that by maybe 0.1 to 0.25. And eventually you'll get to a point where you're flowing at 2 times the speed, and then when you're actually in debate rounds, it just becomes far, far easier for you to flow debaters who are talking much slower than what you're used to. Let's talk about flowing. The first note on flowing, and I will say, I don't have a real theory of flowing, so I don't think there is one optimal way to flow around, and you should absolutely try things to figure out what works best for you. That said, I'll give a couple of pointers and provide you a bunch of options to try. First pointer, flow with what I've been talking about in this workshop in mind. You do not need to have everything written down. You're flowing with the purpose of more compellingly delivering material. So flow to a level of detail that doesn't trade off with the compellingness of your case construction. What is that level? Not totally sure. But general advice is try to write down the claim, the primary mechanisms for the claim, any particularly important analysis that either stands in the way of your case or undergirds large portions of their argument, the impact of their claim, and what they weigh the claim with. Second pointer. Being specific with regards to what they said can increase your compellingness by both a sort of image game with the judges, that is, judges think you are a better debater if you have exactly what mechanism they used, and by allowing you to deliver more compelling, more nuanced refutation. Try to balance that with the previous objective when you're doing this sort of thing. Third pointer, try to flow arguments dynamically. Rather than how did OG make this argument, it's how did this argument evolve between opening government, opening opposition, and closing government, and interact with it there and maybe point out the evolution. Fourth pointer, try to think about your role in the debate. You should flow with that position in mind. So, for example, if you're the deputy prime minister, then carefully pay attention to responses to the prime minister and POIs from closing, in addition to the 2 things I've focused you on in refutation. Those 2 things being the things that are plausibly more important or in the way of your case. If you are the member of opposition, you should be paying close attention for extension openings. Pointer number 5, try to flow hidden assumptions underneath arguments. So what things must be true for this argument to be true that they didn't analyze? 6th pointer, as a deputy speaker, flow your partner's case as if you were an extension speaker, then attempt to preempt any ends that you notice. Here are some things to try. First, use different colored pens, at least red and black for different sides, potentially different colors for different things or teams. The point of this, importantly, is not just to use different colored pens. This is something I did. I just was like, I want to use different colored pens. I don't know if it helped me all that much. Rather, the point is to create habits with regards to what each color means so that you can more fluently switch your brain in the midst of the round, or you can more fluently go through your notes. Second, create a system of shorthand, arrows if online, different formatting, that sort of thing. If on paper, maybe different colors for mechanisms and impacts, etc., to reduce the writing burden. Third, try flowing and creating cases online for a bit. See what sort of organization works well for you there, where you will certainly have a faster writing speed, hopefully, and try to bring that organization maybe back to paper. But obviously you can only replicate it so much. The point is, it often helps you get more organized if you're able to write a little bit faster in round. Fourth thing, consider not writing down all that much until after the speaker's through the portion of the speech that you want to take notes on. This explicitly does not work for me. I forget mechanisms very quickly, and I cannot remember taglines post-argument. But if you have the capacity to store that information in your head, then boiling down to the necessities for tracking post-argument is likely more efficient than tracking everything in the midst of an argument. Fifth, if that doesn't work for you, which is understandable, try focusing more on the speech regardless. So write down the things that you need to during delivery, but hold refutation until after a point is written down. I think this gives you a better vantage point for delivering refutation. I also think this is an underrated strategy because debaters are likely afraid of forgetting the material exactly as it was delivered for responses, but judges are flowing just like this. They don't write down the refutation that you're going to deliver later. If you have an imperfect recollection of what the argument was, they probably also have that imperfect recollection of the argument, which is why, for example, strawmanning happens to work so well. Please don't strawman. Sixth pointer, it might be worth trying to write down strategic notes regarding arguments. I think it is actually worth writing these down. Create a shorthand of symbols for what you want to do with an argument. Say, outweigh it, flip it, wash it away, create a shorthand for all of those things, and what sort of threat the argument likely poses to you. Is it potentially more important than your argument? Does it stand in the way? Create like symbols for that or something. Seventh, similarly, track the function of each argument. What is it that the argument does in the round, and how does it affect the debate in relation to your case? And eighth, try various formats, maybe use separate sheets of paper per speaker, maybe use folded columns, I don't know, do whatever, and to see what works best for you. Okay, that's everything. Thanks for this workshop. I'll see you all in practice on Tuesday.